The coastlines of the world hold secrets that go deeper than any anchor chain. Along these edges where land meets sea, where civilization faces the endless unknown, something waits in the mist and spray. It's not just the danger of hidden rocks or sudden storms, though those claim their share of victims. The sea doesn't just take lives, it erases them completely, leaving families to wonder and investigators to chase shadows across decades of fruitless searching. Eddystone Lighthouse Legacy. They stand like ancient sentinels against the endless Atlantic swells. These coastal guardians that have watched over sailors for centuries. Some rise from clifftops, others from man-made foundations. But none have captured the human imagination quite like the lighthouse that defied the impossible. 13 Mi, southwest of Plymouth, where the English Channel meets the open ocean, a cluster of jagged rocks breaks the surface at low tide. The Eddystone Rocks, as they're known, have claimed more ships than any other reef in British waters. Yet from this graveyard of vessels, 4 different lighthouses have risen across 3 centuries, each one a testament to human determination and the price of progress. The story begins with Henry Winstanley, an eccentric London merchant whose ships had fallen victim to these very rocks. In 1696, Winstanley was no ordinary businessman. He had trained as an engraver and made his fortune through various ventures. But what set him apart was his obsessive personality and his house of wonders in Littlebury, Essex, a mansion filled with mechanical curiosities and practical jokes that amazed visitors. When 2 of his vessels were wrecked on the Eddystone Rocks, Stanley didn't simply write off the losses. Instead, he conceived something that maritime experts declared impossible: building a lighthouse on rocks that disappeared completely at high tide. The challenges were staggering. The Eddystone Rocks lay in some of the roughest waters around Britain, exposed to the full fury of Atlantic storms. At high tide, waves crashed over the highest points of the reef. No structure had ever been built in such conditions, and many considered Winstanley's plan the fantasy of a grief-stricken merchant. But Winstanley possessed something his critics lacked: an unshakable belief in human ingenuity and an engineer's understanding of forces and materials. Work began in 1696 under conditions that would challenge even modern construction techniques. Workers could only access the rocks during calm weather at low tide, giving them just a few hours at a time to work. They had to transport every tool, every stone, every piece of timber by boat across 13 mi of open water. French privateers raided the site during construction, actually capturing Winstanley himself, remarkably. When Louis XIV learned that a lighthouse was being built, he ordered Winstanley's release, declaring that the light would benefit French ships as much as English ones. Winstanley's first lighthouse was unlike anything ever attempted, rising 80 ft above the rocks. It was an ornate wooden structure that looked more like a cathedral spire than a maritime beacon. The base was solid stone, but the superstructure was elaborate timberwork decorated with carved figures, weather vanes, and even a chandelier in the lantern room. Critics called it a folly. But when the light was first kindled on November 14, 1698, it worked. Ships that had feared the Eddystone Passage now had a beacon to guide them safely through the treacherous waters. For 5 years, Winstanley's lighthouse stood against everything the Atlantic could throw at it. The eccentric merchant had created the world's first offshore lighthouse, proving that human engineering could triumph over nature's most hostile environments. But Winstanley was never satisfied. He constantly returned to the lighthouse, adding reinforcements, improving the structure, making modifications. His confidence in his creation was absolute. He famously declared that he wished to be in his lighthouse during the greatest storm that could ever blow. So confident was he in its strength. On November 26, 1703, Winstanley got his wish. The Great Storm of 1703 was the most severe weather event in recorded British history. Winds reached speeds that wouldn't be equaled for centuries. Across England, thousands of homes were destroyed, hundreds of ships were lost and an estimated 8,000 people died. When the storm passed and vessels could finally reach the Eddystone Rocks, they found nothing. The lighthouse had vanished completely, along with Henry Winstanley and 5 other men who had been working on improvements. Not a trace remained of the structure that had defied the ocean for 5 years. The destruction of Winstanley's lighthouse might have ended the dream of marking the Eddystone Rocks, but too many lives depended on safe passage through these waters. In 1706, John Rudyard, a silk merchant from London's Elgate Hill, was commissioned to build a replacement. Rudyard had no engineering background, but he had studied the failure of Winstanley's design and drawn crucial lessons from it. Where Winstanley had built upward with ornate decoration, Rudyard would build for survival. Rudyard's lighthouse, completed in 1708, was a radical departure from its predecessor. Instead of Winstanley's elaborate wooden superstructure, Rudyard had created a simple tapering tower built from overlapping wooden planks like the hull of a ship turned upside down. The design was streamlined to let wind and waves flow around it rather than creating resistance. It lacked the grandeur of Winstanley's creation, but it possessed something more valuable: resilience. For 47 years, Rudyard's lighthouse guided ships safely past the Eddystone Rock. It survived storms that would have destroyed lesser structures, proving that sometimes the humblest solutions are the most effective. The lighthouse keepers who maintained the light lived in isolation that few could imagine, cut off from land for weeks during rough weather. But they kept the flame burning through countless dark nights. The end came not from the sea, but from fire. On December 2nd, 1755, sparks from the oil-burning light ignited the wooden structure. The keeper, Henry Hall, was 94 years old and attended the light for many years. As he tried to fight the flames, molten lead from the lighthouse roof fell into his mouth. Hall survived the fire and the rescue, but died days later from lead poisoning, becoming one of the first recorded cases of heavy metal poisoning in medical history. Rudyard's lighthouse burned to its stone foundation, leaving the Eddystone Rocks unmarked once again. The third lighthouse would become the most famous of all. John Smeen, recommended by the Royal Society, was a mathematical instrument maker who would become known as the first civil engineer. Smeaton studied both previous failures and concluded that the solution lay not in avoiding the sea's power, but in channeling it. He designed his lighthouse like an oak tree, with a broad base tapering to a narrow top, built entirely of interlocking stones that would actually grow stronger under pressure. Construction began in 1756 and took 3 years to complete. Smeen pioneered techniques that would become standard in lighthouse building. Each stone was precisely cut to fit with its neighbors, creating joints so tight that the entire structure acted as a single unit. The foundation stones were dovetailed into the living rock, creating an unbreakable bond between the lighthouse and the reef itself. Portland stone was used for its durability, and the whole structure was designed so that wave action would compress the stones together rather than pull them apart. When Smeen's lighthouse was completed in 1759, it stood 59 feet tall and was considered a masterpiece of engineering. Ship's captains who had known the previous lighthouses marveled at its elegant strength. The structure became so famous that it was studied by engineers across Europe, and Smeen's principles influenced lighthouse design for the next century. For 120 years, Smeen's lighthouse stood as an immovable sentinel on the Eddystone Rocks. It survived the Napoleonic Wars, countless Atlantic storms, and the changing nature of shipping as steam replaced sail. 3 generations of lighthouse keepers lived within its walls, maintaining the light that guided thousands of vessels to safety. The lighthouse became a symbol of British engineering excellence, proof that human skill could create something permanent in the most impermanent of environments. But even Smeen's masterpiece was not eternal. By the 1870s, the constant pounding of waves had begun to crack the rocks beneath the lighthouse. The structure itself remained sound, But its foundation was slowly being undermined by the very forces Smeen had tried to harness. Trinity House, the authority responsible for British lighthouses, faced a difficult decision: attempt repairs to the weakening foundation or build entirely new. The fourth and current Eden Lighthouse was designed by James Douglas, engineer and chief of Trinity House. Douglas had learned from Smeen's techniques while improving upon them with modern materials and methods. His lighthouse, completed in 1882, stood 133 ft tall and incorporated advanced optics that could throw light much further than its predecessors. The new structure was built on a more stable part of the reef, but its design honored the principles that Smeen had established more than a century earlier. The old Smeen Lighthouse was carefully dismantled and rebuilt on Plymouth Hoe, where it still stands today as Smeen's Tower, a monument to engineering achievement. Douglas's new lighthouse took over the vital work of guiding ships past the eddy rocks. Equipped with modern conveniences that would have amazed the keepers of earlier generations, the transition from Smeen's lighthouse to Douglas's marked more than just an engineering upgrade. It represented the changing nature of lighthouse keeping itself. Where earlier generations of keepers had lived in complete isolation, relying on oil lamps and hand-wound clockwork mechanisms, the new lighthouse incorporated telegraph communications and more efficient lighting systems. Yet, the fundamental challenge remained the same: maintaining a light in one of the most hostile marine environments on Earth. The human cost of the Edone lights extended far beyond the famous names like Wynne, Stanley, and Hall, not countless. Workers had risked their lives during construction phases, battling weather and sea conditions that would defeat modern health and safety standards. Lighthouse keepers and their families endured isolation that tested mental and physical endurance. Supply boats could be cut off for weeks during storms, leaving the keepers to survive on whatever provisions they had managed to store. The automation of the Edis Lighthouse in 1982 ended nearly 3 centuries of human habitation on the rocks. The last keepers departed, taking with them generations of accumulated knowledge about reading weather patterns, maintaining equipment under impossible conditions, and surviving in complete isolation. Their departure marked the end of an era, but the lighthouse itself continued its ancient function, now guided by GPS and solar power, rather than human hands and whale oil. Morecambe Bay tragedies. Picture, if you will, a stretch of water that looks peaceful from the shore, where families gather for seaside holidays and children build sandcastles, where Victorian gentlemen once strolled along elegant promenades and ladies took the sea air for their health. But step beyond that shoreline, venture out onto what appears to be solid ground, revealed by the retreating tide, and you enter one of Britain's most deceptive killers, Morecambe Bay. That vast expanse of sand and sea between the coasts of Lanarkshire and Cumbria has been claiming lives for over 1,000 years. Its beauty masks a simple, terrifying truth. When the tide returns, it moves faster than a galloping horse, and there is nowhere to run. The bay stretches across 120 square miles of shifting sands, mudflats and quicksand, creating the largest intertidal area in the United Kingdom. Twice each day, the Irish Sea retreats to reveal what looks like a safe, walkable landscape of firm sand and shallow channels. But this is an illusion. The sands shift constantly. Channels change their course overnight, and what was solid ground yesterday may be deadly quicksand today. The tide, when it returns, doesn't creep in gradually like a bath filling with water. It races across the flats at speeds that can reach 15 minipelus, creating a wall of water that gives no quarter to those caught in its path. The danger is so well known that since 1548, the Crown has appointed an official guide to help travellers cross safely. The Queen's Guide to the Sands, as the position is known today, represents an unbroken line of local knowledge stretching back nearly 5 centuries. These guides learn to read the bay like a book, understanding how wind patterns affect the tides, where the quicksand lurks, and which routes remain safe as the landscape changes with each tide cycle. But even with centuries of accumulated wisdom, even with official guides who know every channel and every danger, Morecambe Bay continues to kill. The crossing of the sands was once essential for commerce and communication. Before the railway arrived in the 1850s, the direct route across the bay could save travellers 20 minutes compared to the journey around the shoreline. Monks from the medieval priories, merchants with their pack trains, and later, stagecoaches full of passengers all relied on the crossing to reach markets and destinations on the far side of the bay. They moved in groups following the guide, timing their journey to avoid both the incoming tide and the notorious patches of quicksand that could swallow a horse and cart hole. The quicksand of Morecambe Bay isn't the dramatic Hollywood version where victims disappear completely beneath the surface. Instead, it's a more insidious trap. The wet sand appears solid underfoot but gives away suddenly, gripping boots and legs with a suction that increases with every movement. Panic makes it worse. The more someone struggles, the deeper they sink and the stronger the sand's grip becomes. Rescue requires calm, methodical work to break the suction, often involving ropes and multiple people working together. But when the tide is coming in, there's no time for careful rescue work. Records from the 18th and 19th centuries document dozens of drowning incidents. Local newspapers reported regularly on bodies washed ashore, victims who had attempted the crossing without proper guidance or who had been caught by unexpectedly fast tides. Parish burial records show a steady stream of drowned crossing the sands entries, each one representing a family's tragedy and a community's loss. The guides themselves weren't immune to the bay's dangers. Several appointed guides died while attempting rescues or were caught by freak weather conditions that changed the tide patterns. One particularly well-documented incident occurred in the winter of 1857 when a group of travellers attempting to cross to Ulverston became trapped by both quicksand and an incoming tide. The guide, working desperately to free those caught in the sand, watched helplessly as the water level rose around them. Of the 7 people who started the crossing, only 3 survived, pulled from the water more dead than alive by rescue boats that had raced out from both shores as word spread of the disaster. The Victorian era brought increased tourism to the Lake District, and many visitors wanted to experience the famous crossing of the sands. This led to more incidents as inexperienced tourists underestimated the dangers or attempted the crossing without proper guidance. Local authorities tried to regulate the crossing, posting warnings and requiring travelers to use the official guide. But the bay's reputation for danger only seemed to attract more risk-takers. The arrival of the railway should have ended the need for the dangerous crossing, but it didn't eliminate the risks. People continued to venture onto the sands for fishing, collecting cockles, or simply for recreation. Each generation seemed to learn the bay's dangers anew, often through tragedy. Local rescue services developed specialized knowledge and equipment for bay rescues, but the fundamental problem remained. Once someone was trapped by quicksand or caught by an incoming tide, time was the enemy. The 20th century brought new understanding of the bay's tidal mechanics and better communication systems, but also new forms of danger. Motor vehicles could travel farther onto the sands than horses and carts, leading to cars being abandoned as tides approached. Aircraft used the firm sands as emergency landing strips during World War II, but several planes were lost to the tide when pilots misjudged the timing. During the 1960s and 1970s, the bay became popular with amateur naturalists and birdwatchers who wanted to observe the thousands of migrating birds that used the mudflats as feeding grounds. This led to several rescue incidents as enthusiasts became so focused on their observations that they lost track of the tide times or wandered into areas of unstable sand. The most tragic incident in the bay's modern history occurred on the evening of February 5, 2004, 23. Chinese cock-alpers working illegally for gangmasters, who cared nothing for their safety, were caught by an incoming tide while working the cockle beds near Hesbank. The cocklers, many of whom couldn't swim and few of whom spoke English, had been taken to the bay without any understanding of the tidal dangers. They had no means of communication with the shore, no knowledge of escape routes, and no understanding of how fast the tide could move. As darkness fell and the tide raced in, mobile phone calls started reaching the emergency services. Desperate voices speaking in Chinese, calling for help that the operators couldn't understand. Sinking water, one voice pleaded in broken English before the line went dead. Rescue services mounted a massive operation using helicopters, lifeboats and local knowledge to search the dark waters. But for most of the cocklers, help came too late. The sole survivor, Gwyn Long, was pulled from the water after clinging to a piece of driftwood for hours. His testimony revealed the horror of that night. Workers scattered across the sands as they realized the danger, the panic as the water rose around them, the futile attempts to reach higher ground that didn't exist. The cocklers had been working in an area that experienced some of the fastest tidal flows in the bay, and when the tide turned, they had no chance of reaching safety. The tragedy exposed the exploitation of vulnerable workers and led to significant changes in labor, laws and gangmaster regulation, but it also served as a stark reminder that Morecambe Bay's fundamental nature hadn't changed despite centuries of human habitation. The tide still moved with the same remorseless speed. The sand still shifted with each tide cycle, and the quicksand still waited to trap the unwary. Local residents who had lived around the bay for generations weren't surprised by the tragedy, though they were horrified by the loss of life. They knew the bay's moods, understood its rhythms, and respected its power. Children growing up near the bay learned from an early age to check tide times before venturing onto the sands, to carry mobile phones, and never to go out alone. But newcomers, visitors, and especially workers brought in from far away often lacked this ingrained caution. The appointment of Michael Wilson as the current Queen's Guide in 2019, following the retirement of Cedric Robinson after 56 years in the role, continues a tradition that stretches back to the reign of Henry VIII. The guides maintain detailed knowledge of safe routes across the bay, but they also serve as educators, helping people understand the risks involved in venturing onto what looks like harmless sand and shallow water. Modern technology has made the bay's dangers more predictable, but not less real. Accurate tide tables, GPS navigation, and mobile phone communications have reduced some risks. But they've also created new dangers as people become overconfident in technology. GPS devices can fail, mobile phones can lose signal, and tide tables can't predict sudden weather changes that affect tidal flow patterns. The bay continues to claim lives in the 21st century, though usually in smaller numbers. Dog walkers who venture too far from shore while exercising their pets, photographers seeking the perfect shot of sunset over the sands, and fitness enthusiasts using the flats for running or cycling. Training all feature in rescue service records. Each incident reinforces the lesson that Morecambe Bay tolerates no assumptions about safety. The landscape of the bay itself continues to evolve. Climate change is affecting tidal patterns, making some traditional knowledge less reliable. Rising sea levels change the dynamics of how quickly areas flood, while changing weather patterns create more unpredictable conditions. The guides adapt their knowledge continuously, learning how new variables affect old dangers. Current safety advice emphasizes that anyone venturing onto Morecambe Bay sands should check tide times, carry communication devices, inform others of their plans, and never go alone. But these precautions assume people recognize the danger in the first place. The bay's greatest weapon remains its ability to appear safe and inviting while concealing deadly hazards beneath its placid surface. The cockle beds that proved so deadly in 2004 still exist, still shift with each tide, and still attract both legal harvesters and illegal operations. Local fishing communities work these waters with generations of accumulated knowledge. But they too treat the bay with constant respect and caution. They know that familiarity with the bay's dangers doesn't eliminate them. It only makes survival more likely. Bell Rock Lighthouse, 1807 to 1811. Sometimes the most dangerous places on Earth reveal themselves only when it's too late to turn back. Off the coast of Scotland, where the North Sea meets the F of Forth, lies a reef that fishermen called the Bell Rock. For centuries, sailors knew to listen for the sound that gave it its name, a bronze bell that rang out across the waves whenever storms stirred the water. Legend says the abbot of Aberoth placed that bell there in the 14th century, chaining it to a wooden buoy so that ships would know to steer clear of the jagged stones lurking just beneath the surface. The bell served its purpose for generations until a pirate named Ralph the Rover cut it loose in a fit of spite, dooming himself to die on the very rocks he had left unmarked. By 1800, the Brock had claimed so many vessels that the Scottish coast was littered with the bones of ships that had trusted to luck rather than light. 11 miles offshore from the fishing town of Arroth, the Bell Rock disappears completely at high tide. When the water recedes, it reveals a jagged reef extending 400 wide in length, with its highest point rising just 4 feet above the low water mark. Ships approaching from any direction faced the same deadly trap. A reef invisible in rough weather, unmarked by any light, claiming vessels with clockwork regularity. Between 1794 and 1800 alone, 70 ships were wrecked on the Bell Rock, taking hundreds of lives and destroying fortunes and cargo. The task of marking this killer reef fell to Robert Stevenson, a 28-year-old engineer whose family would become legendary in lighthouse construction. But in 1800, Stevenson was an untested young man facing what many considered an impossible challenge. No one had ever built a permanent structure on a rock that vanished beneath the waves twice a day. The engineering problems seemed insurmountable. How do you build on a foundation that exists only at low tide? How do you transport materials across 11 miles of open sea? How do you work when your building site disappears for hours at a time? Stevenson spent 2 years studying the problem before construction could even begin. He measured tide patterns, analyzed wind conditions, and calculated the forces that any structure would have to withstand. The rock itself presented unique challenges. It was hard enough to support a lighthouse, but too uneven to provide a ready-made foundation. Every stone would have to be cut to fit perfectly with its neighbors, creating a structure that could resist both the upward pressure of waves and the lateral forces of wind. The construction method Stevenson devised would have challenged engineers today. Every piece of the lighthouse had to be pre-cut on shore, transported by boat, and assembled on the rock during the brief windows when the tide allowed access. Workers had at most 4 hours at a time to work, and only during calm weather. A single miscalculation in timing could strand men on the rock as the tide rose around them, or worse, catch them in the open sea if their boat couldn't reach them in time. Work began in earnest in August 1807, with the first challenge being to level the rock surface and create a foundation. Stevenson's crew used hand tools to shape the living rock, working in shifts that began the moment the tide receded. They started each day in darkness, rowing out from Arbroath before dawn to maximize their working time. The men carried everything they needed: tools, food, water, and building materials in open boats that had to navigate 11 miles of often rough water twice each day. The foundation work alone took months. Each stone had to be precisely cut to fit the irregular surface of the reef, with joints so tight that no mortar was needed. Stevenson had learned from John Smeaton's work on the Edist Lighthouse, but the Bell Row presented even greater challenges. Where Smeaton had worked on a rock that was always above water, Stevenson's men raced against time as the sea reclaimed their workplace twice daily. The logistics of construction defied common sense. Heavy stones weighing several tons each had to be transported across 11 miles of open water, then lowered into precise positions while waves broke over the work site. Specialized barges were built to carry the dress stones. But loading and unloading remained dangerous work. Men balanced on narrow planks over churning water, guiding multi-ton blocks into position with ropes and pulleys powered only by human muscle. Winter storms repeatedly destroyed the temporary structures needed for construction. The beacon that guided supply boats to the rock was swept away 3 times, forcing workers to rebuild it each spring. Tools left on the rock overnight were regularly claimed by high tides, and the temporary huts where men sheltered during the brief windows between tides leaked constantly. Yet Stevenson's crew returned day after day, rebuilding what the sea had destroyed and advancing the work one stone at a time. The human cost of the project remained remarkably low, though several men came close to drowning when caught by rising tides. One incident that became part of Lighthouse legend occurred when 5 workers, including Stevenson himself, were stranded on the rock as an unexpected high tide approached. Their boat had been damaged and couldn't return for them, leaving the men to watch the water rise around them. They climbed to the highest point of the partially built lighthouse and waited as waves crashed over their feet, then their waists. Rescue came when a passing fishing boat spotted them, but the incident demonstrated how quickly the sea could turn deadly for anyone working on the Bell Rock. The lighthouse itself rose slowly through 3 building seasons. Stevenson designed it as a tapering stone tower, wider at the base to resist wave action and narrower at the top to reduce wind resistance. The walls were solid masonry, with each stone cut to interlock with its neighbors using a system of joints that grew stronger under pressure. The internal structure included living quarters for the lighthouse keepers, storage for oil and supplies, and a lantern room equipped with the most advanced optical system available. By 1810, the lighthouse stood 115 feet above high water, its beacon visible for 20 meters in clear weather. The construction had required over 2,500 tons of dress stone, all of it transported to the rock and fitted into place during the brief low tide windows. The project employed over 100 men at its peak, from stonemasons who shaped the blocks on shore to the sailors who risked their lives transporting materials in all weather. The first lighting of the Bell Rock Lighthouse on February 1, 1811 marked the end of one of the most ambitious engineering projects of the 19th century. Ships that had avoided the area for generations could now navigate safely past the reef. Guided by a light that penetrated fog and storm alike, the steady beam became a familiar sight to coastal traders, fishing fleets, and passenger vessels carrying travelers between Scottish ports. Stevenson's achievement extended beyond solving an engineering problem. He had proved that human determination could overcome seemingly impossible natural obstacles. The techniques developed during the Bell Row construction influenced lighthouse building worldwide. The methods for working on submerged sites, the systems for transporting heavy materials over water, and the masonry techniques that created structures capable of withstanding century-long exposure to the sea all became standard practices. The lighthouse keepers who maintained the Bell Rock Light lived in isolation that few could imagine. The keepers, usually working in pairs, were responsible for keeping the oil-burning light operational through every night, maintaining the clockwork mechanism that rotated the beam, and keeping detailed logs of weather conditions and shipping activity. Supply boats visited monthly during good weather, but winter storms could cut the lighthouse off from the mainland for weeks at a time. The psychological challenges of lighthouse keeping on the Bell Rock were severe. The constant sound of waves breaking against stone, the complete isolation from human contact during storms, and the responsibility for maintaining a light that hundreds of ships depended upon tested the mental strength of even experienced keepers. Several men requested transfers after short periods on the rock, unable to cope with the relentless environment. Weather conditions around the Bell Rock range from dead calm to life-threatening storms with little warning. Keepers learned to read the sea and sky with an accuracy that landlubbers couldn't match, predicting when supply boats could safely approach and when the lighthouse would be cut off from the outside world. They developed routines that helped them maintain sanity during weeks of isolation. From daily maintenance schedules to careful rationing of reading materials and other diversions, the lighthouse itself proved remarkably durable. Stevenson's masonry work withstood decades of North Sea storms without significant damage, and the optical system continued to function reliably despite the harsh conditions. Minor repairs and upgrades were carried out during calm weather, but the basic structure remained unchanged for generations. Modern technology eventually transformed the Bell Rock Lighthouse from a manned station to an automated beacon. The installation of electric lighting, radio communications, and automatic rotation systems eliminated the need for permanent keepers, though the lighthouse continued its essential function of marking the reef that had claimed so many vessels. RMS Titanic. Mysteries? 1912. When you survive something that kills over 1,500 people, you carry their voices with you for the rest of your life. 22-year-old Harold Bride knew this better than most. As the junior wireless operator aboard the RMS Titanic, he'd spent the ship's final hours frantically tapping out distress calls while the supposedly unsinkable vessel slowly tilted toward her grave. When the rescue ship, Carpathia, finally pulled him from the icy North Atlantic, his feet was so badly frozen they had to carry him off on the stretcher. But his memory was crystal clear, and what he remembered would fuel debates that continue more than a century later. I was asleep in my bunk when Phillips shook me awake. Bride testified to the American inquiry just days after the disaster. Jack Phillips was the senior wireless operator, a veteran who had been with the Marinette Company for years. He told me we'd struck something, but he didn't seem worried about it. The ship felt steady enough. We'd been getting ice warnings all day, and Phillips had been busy with passenger messages to Cape Race. I remember him saying the passengers wanted to send word they'd arrive early in New York. Bride's account reveals the casual confidence that pervaded the ship even after the collision. I went back to my bunk for a few minutes, but then the captain came to the wireless room. Captain Smith looked serious when he told us to get ready to send out a call for assistance. Phillips asked if we should use the new SOS signal, but the captain said to use CQD first. That was the old Marinette distress call. Send CQD, he said. It's the new call, but it might be your last chance to send it. The wireless room became the nerve center of the disaster as Bride and Phillips worked to summon help from the Black Atlantic night. Phillips was the faster operator, so he handled most of the transmitting while I managed the equipment and helped with receiving. The first response came from a German ship, the Frankfurt, but she was too far away. Then we got the Carpathia. She was 58 miles southeast and coming hard. Captain Rostron himself got on the wireless to confirm they were racing to help us. But it was another ship's response, or lack of response, that would create a mystery lasting generations. There was a ship much closer than Carpathia, Bride recalled. The Californian was just a few miles away. Our operators had been in contact with her earlier that evening. Cyril Evans, their wireless man, had sent us an ice warning around 11 p.m., but Phillips cut him off because we were busy with passenger traffic to Cape Race. Phillips sent back, "Shut up."
Shut up. I'm busy. I'm working Cape Race. Evans went off duty after that.
Cyril Evans, the Californian's 20-year-old wireless operator, had his own story to tell. I'd been working all day sending ice reports to ships in the area, Evans testified. The Californian was stopped dead in a field of pack ice. Captain Lord ordered me to warn all vessels about the dangerous conditions ahead. When I called the Titanic around 11 p.m., their operator told me quite rudely to shut up. I was tired, so I turned off the wireless set and went to bed.
I never heard their distress calls.
The timing proved catastrophic. Just 37 minutes after Evans shut down his equipment, the Titanic struck the iceberg. If I'd stayed on for even an hour longer, Evans later wrote to his parents, I would have heard their first distress call. The Californian was close enough to reach them in time. I've thought about those 37 minutes every day since. Captain Stanley, Lord of the Californian, faced the harshest questioning about his ship's inaction. "We were completely stopped by ice," Lord testified under sharp questioning from Senator William Alden Smith. The night was clear, but very dark with no moon. Around 11:30, my third officer, Stone, reported seeing rockets to the south. I asked if they were company signals. Many shipping lines used colored rockets to communicate with other vessels, Stone said. They appeared to be white rockets, Lord's testimony revealed a series of miscommunications and missed opportunities that may have sealed the Titanic's fate. I told Stone to try signaling the ship with our Morse lamp, but they got no response. Stone reported seeing about 8 rockets over the course of an hour, but he never specifically told me they were distress signals. If I'd known they were distress rockets, I would have ordered our wireless operator back on duty immediately. Third Officer Charles Groves, who had the watch before Stone, provided another perspective. "I saw the lights of a large steamer approaching around 11 p.m., Groves testified. "She looked like a passenger liner, well lit, but she stopped and seemed to put out most of her lights around 11:40. I tried to raise her with our Morse lamp, but got no response. When I went off watch at midnight, I mentioned to Stone that the ship looked odd. She appeared to be steaming away. The wireless operators on both ships held the key to understanding what went wrong. Harold Bride's account shows how close help actually was. We could see the lights of a ship in the distance while we were transmitting," Bride recalled. Captain Smith even mentioned it. He said there was a steamer about 4 points off our port bow. We kept trying to raise her with our radio, but we never got a response. Phillips worked that key until the very end, even after the captain released us from duty. Bride's most haunting testimony described the wireless room's final moments. The power was failing and water was coming into the wireless room. Phillips was still at the key, sending SOS in our position. I went to get our life belts, and when I came back, I found a stoker trying to steal Phillips's life jacket.
I fought him off.
Phillips never even looked up from the wireless key. The man had been sending distress calls for 2 hours straight. The junior operator's account of Phillips's dedication became one of the disaster's most powerful stories. Captain Smith came back to the wireless room around 2:05 a.m. and told us, "Men, you have done your full duty. You can do no more.
Abandon your cabin."
Now it's every man for himself," Phillips kept sending.
I had to drag him away from the apparatus.
Even then, he grabbed the life jacket from the stoker who had tried to steal it earlier. I never saw Phillips again after we left the wireless room. Bride's survival story illustrates the chaos and random chance that determined who lived and died. I ended up in the water near one of the collapsible boats that had floated off the deck upside down. About 30 of us managed to climb onto the overturned hull. We spent hours balancing on that boat, shifting our weight as it rolled with the swells. My feet were in the water the whole time, and I couldn't feel them anymore. The testimony of survivors consistently pointed to the tragedy of the nearby ship. "We could see her lights all night," recalled Colonel Archibald Gracie, a first-class passenger who survived by clinging to the same overturned boat as Bride. "She seemed close enough that we could have rowed to her if we'd had enough lifeboats. The rockets we were firing should have brought any ship running. It's the most heartbreaking part of the whole disaster."
Help was so close.
Captain Arthur Rostron of the Carpathia provided the rescuers' perspective when he testified about the race to reach the Titanic. Received the first distress call at 12:35 a.m. and immediately turned toward the position given. We pushed our engines beyond their rated capacity and arrived at 3:30 a.m., but by then the Titanic had been gone for over an hour. We found only lifeboats scattered across the water and debris from the wreck. Rostron's testimony revealed how the Californian appeared at the scene the next morning. The Californian arrived around 8:30 a.m. after we had picked up all the survivors. Captain Lord came aboard to speak with me, and he seemed quite shaken when he learned.
What had happened?
He said his ship had been stopped in ice all night just a few miles north of the wreck site. The conflicting testimonies created a puzzle that investigators struggled to solve. Evans, the Californian's wireless operator, insisted his equipment could have made the difference. Our wireless set was working perfectly, he testified. If I had stayed on duty or if someone had woken me when they saw the rockets, I could have had a message to the Carpathia and other rescue ships within minutes. The Californian could have been alongside the Titanic in half an hour. Captain Lord maintained that distance and ice conditions made rescue impossible. The ship we saw was not the Titanic, he testified firmly. She was much smaller and appeared to be moving away from us. The rockets we observed were not distress signals. They looked more like company signals or navigation rockets. If we had known a passenger liner was in distress, every man on my ship would have risked his life to help. But Third Officer Stone's testimony raised troubling questions about the Californian's response. I reported the rockets to Captain Lord, but he seemed to think they were not distress signals, Stone recalled. I kept watching the ship through the night, and she gradually disappeared. Around 2 a.m. I noticed she seemed to disappear completely, but I thought she had simply steamed away. Harold Bride's frozen feet kept him hospitalized, while other survivors gave their testimony, but his account became crucial to understanding the wireless communications. Phillips and I had been working together for months, and I knew how dedicated he was to the job. That night, he stayed at his post when he could have saved himself. If the Californian had been listening, Phillips' signals would have brought help in time to save hundreds more lives. The mystery deepened when investigators tried to reconcile the various accounts of positions and distances. Bride recalled specific details about the nearby ship. We could see her mast headlight and side lights clearly. She looked like a steamer, definitely big enough to help. Captain Smith even considered lowering a boat to row over to her, but the distance was too great and the sea was too rough. Evans's testimony revealed the cruel irony of timing. I learned later that Phillips had been annoyed with me for interrupting his work to Cape Race with ice warnings. If I'd stayed on duty just a little longer, or if Phillips hadn't cut me off so rudely, the whole disaster might have turned out differently. 22 minutes after I went to bed, they struck the iceberg. The Californian controversy became one of the most debated aspects of the disaster, with each witness's testimony adding layers to the mystery rather than resolving it. Captain Lord spent the rest of his life defending his actions, while survivors like Bride carried the weight of knowing how close rescue had been. Flannan Isles Lighthouse, 1900. The lighthouse beam cuts through the December darkness like a guardian's eye, steady and sure. Every 30 seconds, 2 white flashes pierce the Highland night from Eileen Moor, the largest of the Flannan Isles, for over a year. This rhythm has never faltered. The men who keep this light understand their sacred duty to guide ships safely past the treacherous reefs that lie hidden beneath the north. Atlantic swells 21 miles west of Lewis. On this remote Scottish island, 3 lighthouse keepers live a life of routine precision. Their world revolves around trimmed wicks, polished lenses, and weather observations noted with careful penmanship in official logbooks. It's December 15th, 1900, and tonight will be different from all the others. Tonight, the light will fail and 3 men will vanish from the earth as completely as if they never existed. But before we understand how their story ends, we must know who they were. James Duckett stands at the top of the 75 FT tower, checking the oil fountain one final time. At 44 years old, he carries himself with the quiet authority of a principal lighthouse keeper. His weathered hands move with practiced certainty across the lens apparatus. Duckett has devoted 22 years of his life to lighthouse service, working his way up from assistant keeper to this position of responsibility. His longest posting was 7 years and 9 months at Rinsley, where the isolation taught him patience and the Atlantic taught him respect. Back home in Brest-on-Lewis, his wife Mary waits with their 4 children. 16-year-old Louisa helps care for her younger siblings. Robert, 13, Annabella, 9, and little Arthur, just 6. Mary understands the lighthouse life better than most wives. Her father and uncle both served as keepers, and she met James in 1881 when they were both stationed at Inchkeith Light. She knows the long silences between reliefs, the worry that comes with Atlantic storms, and the strength required to raise children when their father's duty keeps him on distant rocks. Thomas Marshall, the assistant lighthouse keeper, moves through his evening duties with quiet efficiency. At 40 years old, he came to lighthouse work later than most, having spent his younger years as a seaman. The sea called him back, but this time to serve as its guardian rather than traverse its surface. Marshall never married, never had children. His family consists of his father, brother, and sister, who wait for his letters from this distant posting. He understood loneliness before he came to Flannan, but here, surrounded by endless water, it takes on new meaning. Donald MacArthur represents the tragedy of circumstance. As an occasional keeper, he's filling in for William Ross, who lies ill on shore leave. MacArthur leaves behind a wife and 2 young children, expecting to return home after this temporary assignment. He's the quiet one among the 3, known to keep his thoughts to himself. The other keepers have noticed something different about him during this posting, a tendency toward tears that seems out of character. Perhaps the isolation weighs heavier on men with families waiting. Their daily routine follows the ancient rhythm of lighthouse life. Before dawn, one man climbs the spiral stairs to extinguish the light and clean the lens. As morning breaks, they record weather observations, wind direction, barometric pressure, temperature in the official log. They tend the oil, polish brass, maintain equipment, and prepare for the next lighting. Meals are simple affairs, often eaten in companionable silence. These men understand that conversation is a luxury to be rationed across the long weeks between reliefs. The lighthouse itself stands as a monument to human determination. Designed by David Allen Stevenson, son of the famous lighthouse building family, it took 3 years to construct on this exposed Atlantic outpost. The tower rises from cliffs 200 ft above sea level, its beam visible for 20 meters in clear weather. Below, 2 landing stages allow supply boats to reach the island when conditions permit. The keeper's quarters nestle against the base of the tower, solid stone walls built to withstand whatever the Atlantic can deliver. December brings the worst weather to these waters. The men of weathered storms that would terrify landlubbers. Waves that crash over the lighthouse itself. Winds that shake the solid stone structure. They've learned to read the signs to secure equipment before the worst hits. To trust their shelter when nature unleashes its full fury. On December 13th, James Duckett makes the final entry in the official logbook. The routine observations are recorded with his careful handwriting. Weather conditions, light operations, maintenance completed. December 14th passes without a formal entry, though work continues. The slate board beside the logbook shows the observations for December the 15th. Barometric readings, wind conditions at 9 in the morning. The time the light was extinguished, everything appears normal. The work of men following their established patterns. But something changes on the afternoon of December 15th. The evidence suggests all 3 men left the lighthouse together. An unusual occurrence. 2 sets of foul weather gear are missing from their hooks, oilskins, and sea boots, the kind of protective clothing worn only when going to the landing stages. The 3rd set remains behind, suggesting one man ventured out inadequately dressed for the conditions. Outside, the Atlantic has been building its strength. The western landing stage shows signs of tremendous violence. Iron railings twisted and displaced, a massive stone block weighing over 2,000 weight torn from its position and scattered on the concrete path. A lifebuoy secured to railings 110 ft above sea level has been ripped away by the force of water. The sea has reached heights that seem impossible even for these exposed waters. Joseph Moore approaches Flannan on December 26th aboard the lighthouse tender Hesperus, expecting the routine relief that marks the end of his shore leave. As the ship draws near the landing, he searches for the usual signs of life. The flag flying from the staff, the provision boxes waiting at the landing, the familiar figures of his colleagues preparing for the changeover. The island greets him with silence. Captain Harvey sounds the ship's horn. The sound echoes off the cliffs and dies in the wind.
A rocket fired from the vessel traces its arc against the grey sky, but brings no response from the lighthouse.
The beam that should have guided them through the darkness never appeared the night before. Moore knows this island as well as any man alive. As the fourth keeper in the rotation, he's spent countless weeks in these quarters, climbed these stairs, polished this lens. When he steps onto the landing and finds the gate closed, the door shut tight, he feels the first chill of understanding. Lighthouse keepers always prepare for relief day. They watch for the approaching tender, ready the provision boxes, raise the flag. This silence speaks louder than any shout of alarm. Inside the lighthouse, Moore discovers a scene of interrupted life. The lens and machinery shine with recent cleaning. The kitchen stands tidy, ready for the next meal. 2 beds remain unmade, 1 properly turned down. The clock has stopped, its hands marking a moment, frozen in time. These details paint a picture of men who expected to return, who left their duties with the intention of resuming them. The slate board holds the final evidence of their presence. Weather observations for December 15th recorded but never transferred to the official log. Wind readings, barometric pressure, temperature, the careful notations of men doing their job until the very end. Moore and the volunteers who remain with him search every corner of the small island. They examine the damaged landing stages, scour the cliff paths, investigate every shelter and outcropping. The Flannan is not large. A determined search can cover every accessible spot in a matter of hours, but they find nothing.
No bodies, no clothing, no equipment.
No sign that 3 men ever struggled for their lives against the Atlantic's fury. The investigation that follows brings Superintendent Robert Muirhead to examine every detail. His report, filed January 8, 1901, attempts to construct a logical explanation from the available evidence. The damaged landing stages, the missing foul weather gear, the slate observations all point to the same conclusion. The men left the lighthouse on the afternoon of December 15th, perhaps to secure equipment threatened by the massive waves, and were swept into the sea by an unexpectedly large roller. Yet questions remain. Why would experienced keepers venture out together in such conditions? Why did one man leave without proper weather protection? What could have drawn all 3 from the safety of their quarters when lighthouse protocol demanded at least one keeper remain on duty at all times? Sable Island shipwrecks. There are places on Earth where the ocean itself seems to reach up and pull ships from their course, drawing them down into depths that tell no tales. From the bridge of a modern cargo vessel equipped with GPS satellites and radar systems that can see through fog and darkness, Sable Island appears on the navigation screen as a thin yellow crescent floating in the blue. Waters of the North Atlantic. Computers calculate safe passage routes around this 25 kilometers.
Stretch of sand that sits alone in the ocean. Seems southeast of Halifax, Nova Scotia.
Yet, even with all our modern technology, something ancient stirs beneath these waters. The seafloor around Sable Island holds the broken remains of over 350 ships, their bones scattered across the sandy bottom like fallen leaves. Each wreck represents lives lost, families destroyed, cargo never delivered. This is the true graveyard of the Atlantic, where the sea has claimed vessels for over 4 centuries, and where the pattern of destruction continues to echo through time. August 29, 1583, the first recorded victim of Sable Island's hunger lies broken on the southern shore. The English ship Delight, flagship of Sir Humphrey Gilbert's expedition to claim Newfoundland for Queen Elizabeth, ran ground in dense fog while searching for safe harbour. Gilbert himself sailed on the smaller vessel Squirrel, watching helplessly as his flagship struck the invisible sandbar that extends beneath the surface like grasping fingers. 16 men drowned that day, including the Hungarian scholar Stephen Palmenius, who'd come to document the New World for European readers. The survivors, led by Captain Maurice Brown, salvaged what they could from the wreck before continuing their journey. But Sable Island had tasted European blood and it would not be satisfied with just one meal. The island exists because of a perfect storm of geography and ocean currents. Three major streams converge in these waters: the warm Gulf Stream flowing north from the Caribbean, the cold Labrador Current pushing south from the Arctic, and the Belle-Isle Current carrying icy water from the Gulf of St. Lawrence. Where these currents meet, they create unpredictable eddies and crossflows that can push even experienced navigators off course. The island itself shifts like a living thing. Made entirely of sand deposited by these currents, Sable Island moves constantly. Its eastern and western ends migrate with each storm, growing and shrinking as the ocean reshapes its boundaries. What appears on today's charts may not match tomorrow's reality. The island that claimed a ship last year may be miles away when the next vessel searches for the wreck. By 1600, enough ships had vanished near Sable Island that French fishermen began calling it Île Bay, Sand Island. But sailors had darker names for it. Some called it the Ship Killer. Others simply marked their charts with the warning, "Avoid at all costs." The pattern of destruction followed the rhythm of Atlantic shipping. As trade between Europe and North America expanded through the 1600s and 1700s, more vessels ventured across these waters. Merchant ships loaded with manufactured goods sailed west to the colonies, returning east with timber, furs, and fish. Each ship that passed near Sable Island rolled the dice with death. In 1760, the British transport ship Granby struck the island's northwest bar during a blizzard. All 64 souls aboard perished in the freezing waters. The ship carried military supplies to the garrison at Halifax, but the cargo meant nothing to the hungry sea. In 1780, the merchant vessel Betsy ran aground with a full load of rum and molasses from the West Indies. The crew managed to reach shore but spent 3 weeks on the barren island before rescue arrived. The island's isolation made survival nearly impossible for shipwreck victims.
No trees grew on the shifting sands.
No fresh water bubbled from springs. The only vegetation consisted of coarse grass and beach peas that grew in scattered patches. Seals hauled out on the beaches and seabirds nested in the dunes. But catching them required tools and skills that few shipwreck survivors possessed. Stories spread through maritime communities about the horrors awaiting anyone unfortunate enough to reach Sable Island alive. Sailors spoke of crews who survived the initial wreck only to starve on the barren shores. Others told of men driven mad by isolation, fighting over scraps of food salvaged from their ship stores. The island became synonymous with slow death, a place where the sea granted the mercy of survival only to withdraw it slowly through starvation and exposure. The early 1800s brought the golden age of Atlantic shipping, and with it a dramatic increase in Sable Island's appetite. The packet ships that carried mail and passengers between Europe and America followed.
Routes that passed dangerously close to the island.
In 1802, the packet ship Francis broke apart on the northeast bar, drowning 47 passengers and crew. In 1817, the merchant vessel Harriet struck during a fog bank so thick that the crew never saw land until the waves crashed over their deck. Public outcry over these disasters finally prompted government action. In 1801, Nova Scotia's Lieutenant Governor, Sir John Wentworth, established the Humane Establishment, a life-saving station designed to rescue shipwreck survivors and guide vessels safely past the island's dangers. The first life-saving crew consisted of just 3 men who lived year-round on Sable Island, maintaining supplies for shipwreck victims and patrolling the shores for signs of disaster. The Humane Establishment marked the beginning of humanity's fight against Sable Island's deadly reputation. In 1873, twin lighthouses rose from the eastern and western ends of the island, their beams cutting through fog and darkness to warn approaching vessels. The East Light and West Light became the island's first permanent structures, concrete symbols of human determination to defeat the graveyard of the Atlantic. But even as rescuers worked to save lives, the wrecks continued. The immigrant ship Hungarian sank in 1860 with a loss of 205 lives. The steamship Arcadia foundered in 1868, drowning 45 souls. Each disaster brought new calls for better safety measures, more lighthouses, stronger rescue capabilities. The most horrific disaster in Sable Island's vicinity occurred on April 1, 1873, when the White Star Line steamship Atlantic struck the rocks near Lower Prospect, Nova Scotia, just 60 miles from Sable Island. The ship carried 952 passengers and crew, most of them Irish immigrants seeking new lives in America. Captain James Williams, desperately low on coal, had changed course for Halifax instead of New York. In the pre-dawn darkness, the ship struck the granite ledges with such force that it broke in two. 565 people died in the freezing Atlantic waters, making it the worst passenger ship disaster before the Titanic. The tragedy sent shockwaves through the maritime world and led to new international safety regulations. Yet, it also highlighted the dangerous waters around Sable Island, where fog, currents, and hidden obstacles created perfect conditions for disaster. As the 19th century progressed, Sable Island's life-saving crews became legendary for their courage and skill. They rescued survivors from over 100 shipwrecks, pulling men and women from the surf when death seemed certain. The island's superintendent, charged with overseeing rescue operations, became one of the most important maritime safety officials in the North Atlantic. The life-saving stations evolved into small communities, complete with families, livestock, and gardens that struggled to grow in the sandy soil. Children born on Sable Island grew up surrounded by the constant reminder of the sea's power, playing among the ribs of wrecked ships that emerged from the shifting dunes. By 1895, 5 life-saving stations stretched along the
island's length,
each staffed by men who understood that their mission meant the difference between life and death for anyone unlucky enough to find their ship on Sable's bars. They maintained houses of refuge stocked with food, firewood, and blankets. They drilled constantly with rescue equipment, surf boats, lifelines, and breeches buoys that could carry survivors from wrecked ships to safety. The rescuers developed an almost supernatural ability to sense approaching disaster. They read the weather signs, watched for ships in distress, and maintained constant vigilance during the storm season. Many times they spotted vessels in trouble before the crews themselves realized their danger, launching rescue operations that saved hundreds of lives. Yet Sable Island's hunger never diminished. The steamship Crofton Hall ran ground in 1898, its crew saved by breeches buoy in a dramatic rescue that required 17 trips through the surf. The fishing schooner Gale was swallowed by the sand dunes in 1945, its hull disappearing beneath the shifting surface as if the island itself had opened its mouth to consume the vessel. The island's deadliest period coincided with World War II, when increased shipping traffic brought more vessels through these dangerous waters. Merchant ships, often sailing without escort to avoid German U-boat, found themselves at the mercy of Sable Island's ancient appetite. The war years saw dozens of wrecks. Though many details remain classified in military archives, the development of radar and GPS navigation in the late 20th century finally began to break Sable Island's deadly pattern. Modern vessels could see through fog, navigate by satellite, and receive constant weather updates that helped them avoid the worst conditions. The last major shipwreck occurred in 1947, ending an era of destruction that had lasted over 3 centuries. In 1999, the small yacht Merrimack became Sable Island's final recorded victim, sinking on July 27th with the loss of all aboard. The incident served as a reminder that even modern navigation equipment cannot completely eliminate the dangers posed by this shifting sand island in the middle of the North Atlantic. Today, Sable Island operates as a scientific research station and national park. Its lighthouses automated and its rescue stations abandoned to the wind and sand. Scientists study the island's unique ecosystem, monitoring the wild horses that have roamed its dunes for centuries and cataloguing the seabirds that nest in its grass-covered interior. But beneath the research, station's modern facilities and conservation efforts. The bones of over 300 ships rest in the sand. Every storm uncovers new artifacts, ships, bells, cargo containers, personal belongings of passengers who never reach their destinations. The island continues to shift and change, sometimes revealing wrecks that have been buried for decades, other times covering recent discoveries with fresh layers of sand. The contrast between historical and modern Sable Island illustrates humanity's ongoing struggle with the natural world. Where once ships disappeared into fog banks with no way to call for help, today's vessels carry multiple communication systems, weather routing services, and satellite tracking that allows rescue services to monitor their progress in real time. The Coast Guard's Marine Rescue Centre in Halifax coordinates search and rescue operations across thousands of square miles of North Atlantic waters using helicopters, fixed-wing aircraft and high-speed rescue vessels that can reach Sable Island within hours of receiving a distress call. Modern meteorology provides precise forecasts of the storms that once appeared without warning to claim entire ships. Yet the fundamental dangers remain unchanged. The same currents that confused 18th century navigators still flow around Sable Island. The same fog banks that hid the island from approaching vessels still form when warm Gulf Stream water meets cold northern air. The sandbars still shift position with each storm, creating new hazards where none existed before. Marine archaeologists have mapped many of the wrecks surrounding Sable Island, creating an underwater museum of maritime history. Each ship tells a story of human ambition meeting natural forces, of technological progress challenged by elemental power. The wooden sailing ships of the 1700s lie near the steel. Steamships of the early 1900s there remains mixing on the seafloor in a democratic graveyard, where all vessels are equal in death. Long Lighthouse and the Fourth Eight, the wind screams across the Farne Islands like something alive and hungry, driving salt spray high into the air where it catches the first grey light of dawn. September 7th, 1838. The storm that began yesterday evening shows no sign of weakening. 2-year-old Grace Darling stands at the upper window of Longstone Lighthouse, her eyes scanning the churning waters around the rocky outcrop she calls home. The lighthouse beam has been extinguished for the morning, its duty done until nightfall returns. But something dark against the white foam of breaking waves catches her attention. A ship broken, wedged against the jagged rocks of Big Harker, half a mile from where she stands. What Grace sees in those first moments will transform her from a lighthouse keeper's daughter into one of the most famous women in Victorian Britain. But her story begins not with fame, but with the voices of those who lived through that terrible night. The survivors who clung to life on a storm-battered wreck, waiting for rescue that seemed impossible. Sarah Dawson remembers the sound of splintering wood. The mother of 2 young children, she had been travelling aboard the paddle steam of Forfure with her family bound from Hull to Dundee. The ship carried 63 souls through waters that grew more treacherous with each passing hour. Captain John Humble pushed his vessel forward despite mechanical problems that had plagued the journey from the start. The Forfare's boilers had been leaking since departure. Chief Engineer Alan Stewart organised pumps to remove water from the hull and refill the failing boiler, but the leak proved too severe. As they battled up the Northland coast, passengers found themselves pressed into service at the pumps, working desperately to keep their ship afloat. When the boilers finally gave way completely, Captain Humble faced an impossible choice. Without steam power, the Forfeiture could only rely on her emergency sails. In the gathering storm, with visibility dropping and waves growing mountainous, Humble attempted to find shelter behind the Farne Islands. The Farne Islands rise from the North Sea like the backbone of some sleeping giant. 20 rocky outcrops that appear and disappear with the tides. Trinity House had recognized the danger these waters posed to shipping. installing 2 lighthouses to guide vessels safely past the hidden reefs. The inner light marked the passage closest to shore, while the newer Longstone Light, where Grace lived with her parents, warned ships away from the outermost dangers. But on this night, the storm created conditions that turned navigation into guesswork. Captain Humble may have mistaken the 2 lighthouse positions, believing his ship was safely between the mainland and the innermost islands. Instead, the forefitter drove hard onto the rocks of Big Hawker with such violence that the impact split her hull in 2. The stern section, crowded with passengers, sank almost immediately. Men, women, and children disappeared beneath the black waters before they could cry out for help. Those who managed to launch a lifeboat from the sinking stern faced their own battle for survival in seas that seemed determined to claim every soul aboard. Captain Humble was swept overboard and drowned as his command broke apart beneath him. His wife clung to whatever wreckage she could find, but the Atlantic took her as well. Of the 63 people who had been aboard the Forfure when she struck the reef, only a handful remained alive in the bow section that had wedged itself against the rocks. Sarah Dawson found herself in the forward cabin as water poured through the shattered hull. Her 2 children had been torn from her arms by the initial impact, their small bodies lost to the hungry sea. She clutched their lifeless forms to her chest, unable to accept what the storm had stolen from her. Around her, other survivors called out in the darkness, their voices barely audible above the howling wind. 9 people clung to life in that broken bow section. 5 crew members, sailors who knew the sea's moods but found themselves as helpless as any landlubber. Against this fury, 4 passengers who had paid for safe passage and, instead, found themselves stranded on a reef, with death stalking every wave that crashed over their refuge. James Kelly, one of the surviving crewmen, would later describe the longest night of his life. The broken ship groaned and shifted with each wave, threatening to break apart completely and dump them all into the freezing water. They had no food, no fresh water, no shelter from the driving rain and spray. 3 passengers, 2 children, and the Reverend John Robb died of exposure during those dark hours, their bodies growing cold as the survivors huddled together for warmth. As dawn approached, the tide began to fall, revealing more of the rocky platform where the bow section had grounded. The survivors could see they were trapped on Big Har, a barren outcrop barely large enough to hold their broken ship. The mainland seemed impossibly distant, and they had no way to signal for help. From her window in Long Lighthouse, Grace Darling spotted the wreck at 4:45 in the morning. The darkness and poor weather prevented her from seeing any signs of life, but she immediately alerted her father, William Darling, the lighthouse keeper. Together, they watched and waited for better light to reveal whether anyone had survived the disaster. William Darling had spent his adult life tending lighthouses, understanding better than most the price of the sea's anger. At 52 years old, he knew these waters intimately, every current, every hidden rock, every mood of the weather that could transform a routine voyage into a death sentence. When he looked through his telescope at Sevener and saw figures moving on the wreck, he faced the same impossible choice that confronted every lighthouse keeper, whether to risk his own life and that of his daughter to save strangers. The village of sea houses lay across several miles of storm-tossed water. William Darling knew the local lifeboat crew would launch if they spotted the wreck, but the poor visibility made that uncertain. He and Grace could not know if help was coming or if they represented the only hope for the people trapped on Big Har. Grace herself would later write about those crucial moments. I was very anxious and did render every assistance that lay in my power, but my father was equally so, and needed not to be urged by me, he being so experienced in such things. The popular myth that Grace pleaded with her reluctant father to attempt the rescue was just that, a myth. Both father and daughter understood the risks and the necessity with equal clarity. Their boat was a 21F Cobble, a traditional Northumbrian fishing vessel designed for coastal waters. In normal conditions, it could handle moderate seas with ease, but the storm that wrecked the Fourier was far from normal conditions. Waves crashed over the rocks with such force that they threw spray 100 ft into the air. The wind threatened to drive any small boat onto the same reefs that had claimed the steamship. William Darling later wrote to Trinity House describing their decision. Having no idea of a possibility of a boat coming from North Sunderland, we immediately launched our boat. They took the more sheltered route between the islands, which meant rowing nearly a mile through waters that could kill them both in an instant. As Grace and her father pulled against the storm, the survivors on Big Hark spotted their small boat fighting through the waves. James Kelly, the crewman, called out to his companions that rescue was coming. Sarah Dawson, still holding her dead children, looked up to see two figures in a tiny boat, risking everything to reach them. The rescue itself required seamanship skills that few people possessed. William Darling had to maneuver his cobalt close enough to the rocks for the survivors to climb aboard, but not so close that the waves would dash his boat against the reef. Grace held the boat steady in the churning water while her father helped the survivors into their craft. The first trip carried Sarah Dawson and 4 men back to Longstone Lighthouse. Grace later recalled the sight of the grieving mother, still clutching her children's bodies, unable to speak or even acknowledge the rescue taking place around her. William Darling and 2 of the rescued men immediately returned to Big Hark for the remaining 4 survivors. Sarah Dawson's testimony of those hours at Longstone Lighthouse reveals the human cost of maritime disaster. She described a young woman who treated the survivors with gentle kindness, helping them out of their wet clothes, sharing what food the lighthouse could provide, and offering comfort to people who had lost everything. Grace's mother was away visiting other family members, leaving Grace as the only woman to care for the shocked and injured survivors. The rescued passengers and crew members spent 3 days at Longstone Lighthouse before the weather calmed enough for them to reach the mainland. During those days, they witnessed the daily life of a lighthouse family, the routine maintenance of the light apparatus, the careful recording of weather observations, the isolation that defined existence on these remote rocks. James Kelly, the surviving crewman, would spend the rest of his life telling anyone who would listen about the courage of Grace Darling and her father. He described watching Grace handle the boat with the skill of someone who had grown up on these waters, never showing fear, even as waves threatened to swamp their small craft. The broader rescue operation revealed both the heroism and tragedy of that September morning. While Grace and William Darling saved 9 lives, the lifeboat from Sea Houses managed to reach Big Har later that day to recover the bodies of 3 people who had died during the night, 2 children, and Reverend Rob. Other survivors from the stern section had been picked up by a passing sailing vessel after spending hours in their own small boat. News of the rescue spread across Britain with unprecedented speed. The combination of a young woman's courage, the dramatic nature of the rescue, and the tragic loss of life captured the public imagination in ways that transformed Grace Darling from an unknown lighthouse keeper's daughter into a national heroine. The survivor accounts painted a picture of someone who never sought fame or recognition for her actions. Grace Darling simply saw people in danger of dying and acted according to her conscience and training. She later wrote that the rescue was a joint effort with her father, dismissing suggestions that she had been the driving force behind the decision to launch their boat. Sarah Dawson's later testimony provided some of the most moving accounts of Grace's character. The grieving mother described a young woman who showed particular sensitivity to her loss, helping her prepare her children's bodies for burial and sitting with her during the darkest hours of grief. Grace never spoke of her own fear during the rescue, focusing instead on the practical needs of the people she had helped save. The technical details of the rescue, as recorded by William Darling in his official report to Trinity House, reveal the complexity of the operation. The first trip to Big Har had to carry Grace, William, and 5 survivors back to the lighthouse, a dangerous overload for a boat already fighting heavy seas. The second trip required William to return with 2 of the strongest survivors to help manage the boat while rescuing the remaining 4 people. But weather records from that day show wind speeds that would challenge modern rescue vessels. The tide conditions meant that the survivors had only a narrow window when the rocks were exposed enough to allow boat access. If Grace and William had delayed their rescue attempt by even a few hours, the rising tide might have swept the survivors into the sea. The rescue established patterns that would influence maritime safety for generations. The courage shown by lighthouse families in extreme conditions led to better training and equipment for lighthouse keepers. The public attention focused on the Forfear disaster contributed to improved safety regulations for passenger steamships. Grace. Darling's fame brought her correspondence from around the world, with people praising her courage and asking for details about the rescue. She answered as many letters as she could, always emphasizing that her father deserved equal credit for their joint action. The attention overwhelmed someone who had grown up in the isolation of lighthouse life, but she handled it with the same steady character she had shown during the rescue. The economic impact of the disaster rippled through the shipping industry. The Forfear had been carrying valuable cargo as well as passengers, and her loss represented significant financial damage for her owners. Insurance companies began requiring better safety equipment and more rigorous inspections of steam boilers after the investigation revealed the mechanical failures that contributed to the disaster. Years after the rescue, Grace Darling died of tuberculosis at age 26, having never married or left the lighthouse life that had shaped her character. Her death only increased her legendary status, preserving forever the image of a young woman who risked everything to save strangers from the sea. Carol A. Daring, 1921, steam rises from the morning coffee as Coast Guard surfman C.P. Brady begins his shift at Cape Hatteras Station. January 31st, 1921, 6:30 in the morning, and the Carolina coast spreads before him in shades of grey and white. Winter storms have been pounding the Outer Banks for days, turning the sea into a cauldron of foam and fury. Brady knows these waters better than most men know their own backyards. Every current, every sandbar, every trick of light that can fool even experienced eyes. But what he sees through the lifting mist at Diamond Sculls stops him cold. A 5-masted schooner sits motionless on the notorious sandbars. Her sails still set, her hull dark against the breaking waves. She appears completely abandoned, riding the swells like a floating tomb. This is how the mystery begins, with the discovery of the Carol Deering, perfectly preserved but empty of human life. Her crew vanished as completely as if they had never existed. Now we must work backwards through time to understand how 11 men disappeared without a trace, leaving behind one of the most baffling maritime mysteries in American history. The investigation that follows Brady's discovery will consume federal agents, Coast Guard officials, and government bureaucrats for months. They will chase theories ranging from mutiny to piracy, from foreign spies to simple accident. But the more they dig into the final voyage of the Carol A. Deering, the deeper the mystery becomes. Agent Thompson of the FBI arrives in Dare County in July 1921, 6 months after the discovery. He carries with him theories that seem pulled from the pages of adventure novels. Stories of Bolivik-sympathizing pirates, rum-running gangsters operating off the Carolina coast, and crew members who may have turned against their officers in the waters near Diamond Sculls. Thompson's investigation reveals the first disturbing pattern. On January 29th, 2 days before Brady spotted the abandoned schooner, the Carol Deering passed the Cape Lookout lightship under circumstances that would later seem ominous. The lightship keeper, a man trained to observe and record maritime traffic, noted something unusual about the vessel's crew. A crewman who approached the rail to communicate with the lightship did not look or act like an officer. His behavior struck the keeper as odd, nervous, unfocused, as if he were playing a role he didn't understand. The man reported that the ship had lost its anchors, a serious problem for any vessel, but his manner suggested something more troubling than mechanical difficulties. The following day brought another strange encounter. At approximately 5:45 in the evening, the steamship Elon spotted the Carol Deering southwest of the Diamond Sculls lightship. Captain Johnson of the Lake Elon would later report that the schooner seemed to be steering a peculiar course, zigzagging through waters that demanded precise navigation. This was the last confirmed sighting of the Carol Deering with her crew aboard. Whatever happened to the 11 men occurred in the 12 hours between that encounter and Brady's discovery of the abandoned vessel. When the rescue vessel Rescue finally reached the stranded schooner on February 4th, Captain James Carlson's boarding party found a scene that defied explanation. The ship remained in remarkably good condition despite 4 days on the treacherous Diamond shores. Her cargo sat undisturbed in the hold. Her rigging showed signs of recent maintenance. Even food lay prepared in the galley, as if the crew had simply stepped away from an interrupted meal. But critical items were missing. All personal belongings had been removed. Clothing, photographs, letters from home, the small possessions that sailors carry to remind them of life beyond the sea. The ship's navigation equipment had vanished completely, including the chronometer, sea extant, and compass that would be essential for determining position and course. Most telling of all, the ship's log was gone, taking with it any record of the final hours before the crew's disappearance. The investigation now turns backward to the ship's departure from Barbados, searching for clues in the weeks leading up to the mystery. What emerges is a portrait of a voyage troubled from the beginning by personality conflicts and mechanical problems that created an atmosphere of tension aboard the 5-masted schooner. Captain Willis B. Wormel commanded the Carol Deering on her final voyage, but he was not the ship's original master. Captain William Merritt had taken the vessel south to Barbados with a cargo of coal, but reported crew trouble and left the ship at Lewis, Delaware, citing ill health. Merritt's departure forced the G.G. Deering Company to find a replacement captain on short notice. Wormel, known to his friends as Old Bill, brought 40 years of sailing experience to the command. He had earned a reputation as a competent seaman who could handle difficult crews and challenging weather. But at 66 years old, Wormel represented the old guard of American sailing, a generation that had learned seamanship on wooden ships, powered only by wind and human muscle. The crew were inherited reflected the changing nature of maritime employment in the early 1920s. First mate Charles B. Millellan, 37 years old and ambitious, came from a seafaring family, but lacked the deep experience of older officers. The conflict between captain and first mate would become a central element in later theories about the ship's fate. Millellan had sailed with Captain Merritt on the southbound voyage and apparently resented the change in command. Witnesses in Barbados reported heated arguments between Wormel and his first mate over navigation decisions and crew discipline. The tension between the two men created an atmosphere of uncertainty that affected the entire crew. The other crew members brought their own backgrounds and motivations to the voyage. Engineer Herbert Bates, experienced steamship man temporarily working aboard a sailing vessel, kept the auxiliary engine running and maintained the ship's mechanical systems. Steward Leon Clary managed the galley and provisions, while seamen like Henry Jorgensen and Paul Bron handled the day-to-day sailing operations. These men shared the cramped quarters of the Carol Deering for weeks. Their relationships, shaped by the close confines of shipboard life, and the stress of handling a large sailing vessel in winter weather. By all accounts, Captain Wormel struggled to maintain discipline among a crew that seemed increasingly restless as the voyage progressed. The investigation reveals additional problems that plagued the return journey from Barbados. The ship's auxiliary engine developed mechanical issues that required constant attention from Engineer Bates. Fresh water supplies ran low, forcing the crew to ration drinking water during the final days of the voyage. Food stores also dwindled, creating additional stress among men already struggling with interpersonal conflicts. Weather conditions during the northbound voyage proved challenging even by winter standards. The Carol Deering battled headwinds and rough seas that slowed her progress and tested the seamanship of her crew. Captain Wormel's log entries from early in the voyage described mounting frustration with both weather and crew performance. The ship's final cargo consisted of coal loaded in Barbados for delivery to East Coast ports. This bulk cargo, while valuable, created additional hazards during rough weather. Coal dust could ignite if improperly handled, and shifting cargo could affect the vessel's stability in heavy seas. The crew had to constantly monitor and adjust the load to maintain safe sailing conditions. Coast Guard investigators focus particular
attention on the events of January 23rd when the Carol
Deering put into Lewis, Delaware for unknown reasons. Captain Wormel went ashore briefly but left no record of his activities or the purpose of the stop. Some witnesses reported seeing him in conversation with harbor officials, while others claimed he appeared
anxious about continuing this
voyage. The stop at Lewis provided the last opportunity for anyone to
leave the ship before the final leg of the journey.
Immigration records show no crew changes, but the brief port call remains a puzzle piece that investigators cannot properly fit into the larger picture of the ship's fate. After leaving Lewis, the Carol Deering sailed into increasingly dangerous waters off the Carolina coast. The area around Cape Hatteras, known as the graveyard of the Atlantic, had claimed hundreds of vessels over the centuries. Diamond Sculls, where the ship was ultimately found, represented one of the most treacherous navigational hazards on the East Coast. The investigation reveals that Captain Wormel was familiar with these waters from previous voyages. He understood the dangers posed by shifting sandbars, strong currents, and sudden weather changes that could drive even experienced sailors off course. His knowledge of local conditions makes the ship's final grounding even more mysterious. FBI agent Thompson's interviews with local residents uncover stories that add layers of complexity to the mystery. Some fishermen report seeing lights and hearing voices from the direction of Diamond Sculls on the night before the ship's discovery. Others describe unusual activity by unknown vessels in the area during the days surrounding the Carol A. Deering's disappearance. The rum-running theory gains credibility from the reality of Prohibition-era smuggling operations along the Carolina coast. The remote waters around Cape Hatteras provided ideal cover for vessels transferring illegal alcohol from offshore ships to smaller boats that could reach secluded landing points. Several known bootlegging operations were active in the area during 1921. Government investigators also pursue the possibility of foreign involvement in the crew's disappearance. The post-World War I period brought heightened concern about Bolshevik agents operating in American waters. Some theories suggest that the Carol Deering's crew may have been kidnapped by foreign operatives, seeking to obtain information about American shipping, routes and cargo operations. The mutiny theory emerges from testimony about the ongoing conflict between Captain Wormel and First Mate Malellen. Coast Guard officials theorize that the first mate may have led a crew revolt against the captain's authority, possibly resulting in violence that forced the conspirators to abandon ship to avoid prosecution for mutiny or murder. Captain Balance of the Cape Hatteras Coast Guard Station offers his own analysis based on years of experience with maritime disasters. He believes the crew abandoned the ship intentionally after removing everything of value, then deliberately ran the vessel onto Diamond shores to cover their tracks. This theory suggests a calculated plan rather than a spontaneous act of violence or panic. The investigation expands to include searches for the missing lifeboats that would have been necessary for the Crews escape from the Carroll, a Deering coast. Guard vessels patrol hundreds of miles of coastline looking for evidence of the boats or their occupants. They find nothing. No wreckage, no bodies, no personal belongings that might indicate where the crew went after leaving their ship. Mrs. Lula Wormel, the captain's daughter, travels to Washington in May 1921 to meet with Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover. Her emotional plea for a thorough investigation helps maintain government interest in the case, but also reveals the human cost of maritime mysteries. Families left behind struggle with uncertainty, unable to mourn properly or move forward with their lives. The hoax perpetrated by Christopher Columbus Gray of Buckton, North Carolina, demonstrates the public fascination with the Carroll A. Deering mystery. Gray's fabricated message in a bottle, supposedly written by engineer Herbert Bates and describing the ships captured by pirates, creates a sensation in newspapers across the country before handwriting experts expose it as a fraud. Gray's motivation for creating the fake message remains unclear, but his actions highlight the way mysterious disappearances can capture public imagination and inspire people to become part of the story through deception or wishful thinking. The incident also complicates the official investigation by forcing agents to pursue false leads and verify dubious evidence. As months pass without resolution, the Carroll A. Deering investigation becomes a symbol of the limitations facing law enforcement in the early 1920s. Without modern communication systems, forensic techniques, or international cooperation agreements, investigators struggle to piece together events that occurred in remote waters with no witnesses except the missing crew members. The case files grow thick with theories, interviews, and reports, but conclusive evidence remains elusive. Each new lead seems to generate more questions than answers. The 11 men who sailed north from Barbados aboard the Carroll Deering have vanished as completely as if they never existed, leaving behind only an empty ship and a mystery that will endure for generations. The physical evidence tells a story of interruption rather than struggle. The prepared food in the galley suggests the crew expected to return to their meal. The missing personal belongings indicate a deliberate removal rather than hasty abandonment. The absent navigation equipment points to someone who understood its value and importance, yet the ship herself shows no signs of violence or damage beyond what might be expected from running aground on Diamond shores. Her rigging remains intact, her cargo undisturbed, her structure sound enough to survive several days pounding on the sandbars. Whatever happened to her crew left no physical trace aboard the vessel they called home. Scaryvore Lighthouse, 1844. Perfection burns in the mind like fever. It consumes reason, devours sleep, and transforms reasonable men into creatures driven by impossible standards. The year is 1844, and in the offices of the Northern Lighthouse Board in Edinburgh, Alan Stevenson sits surrounded by architectural drawings that represent 6 years of his life. Every line on these papers has been calculated, recalculated and refined until the measurements exist to fractions of inches. The lighthouse that will rise from these plans on Scaryvore Reef must be perfect. Not just good enough, not merely adequate, but absolutely perfect. Stevenson understands that anything less than perfection will mean death for the men who sail past this lonely rock, 11 mids southwest of Tay. The reef that bears the Gaelic name Skia Mahor, the Great Rock, has already claimed ships and lives. It lurks just below the surface at high tide, a 24-acre trap of granite that appears and disappears with the swells. Ships that survive the notorious waters around Cape Wrath and navigate safely past the Hebrides can still die on Scaryvore's hidden fangs. But perfection demands sacrifice, and Alan Stevenson's obsession with creating the ultimate lighthouse will push him and his workers to the edge of disaster, testing whether human will can overcome the raw fury of the North Atlantic. The project begins with optimism that quickly curdles into desperation. On June 8, 1838, Stevenson lands on Scaryvore with his first crew of workmen, their boats loaded with timber and tools for building a temporary barracks. The plan seems straightforward. Erect housing for the workers, establish a base of operations, and begin the systematic construction of what will become Scotland's tallest lighthouse. The reef that will hold the lighthouse measures barely 400 ft in length and 100 ft in width. At low tide, it rises 12 ft above the water. At high tide, waves wash completely over its surface. There is no shelter from wind or weather, no fresh water, no soil for growing food. Every piece of equipment, every scrap of building material, every bite of food must be transported by boat from the mainland across waters that can turn murderous without warning. Alexander Sinclair, the foreman mason, surveys the exposed rock that will serve as the foundation for their great project. He has worked on lighthouse construction before, but never in conditions this extreme. The granite surface shows the scars of countless storms, smooth hollows carved by waves, cracks where ice has split the stone, surfaces polished to mirror brightness by centuries of salt spray. The workers attack their first task with the confidence of men who believe they understand the challenge ahead. They mark locations for the barracks posts, set up temporary workshops, and begin the careful process of cutting foundation holes in the solid granite. The work proceeds slowly but steadily through the summer months of 1838. Stevenson drives himself and his men with an intensity that begins to worry even the most dedicated workers. He arrives on the rock at 4 in the morning and works until 8 at night, allowing only 2 brief breaks for meals. The 17-hour workdays become routine, pushing men beyond normal endurance in conditions that test the strongest constitutions. The engineer's attention to detail borders on the obsessive. He personally inspects every joint, every angle, every measurement, work that other supervisors might approve with a glance. Stevenson examines with magnifying glasses and precision instruments. He rejects stones that other engineers would consider perfectly adequate, demanding that each block meet specifications calculated to the nearest fraction of an inch. The men begin to understand that they are not just building a lighthouse, they're attempting to create a structure that will stand against the worst the Atlantic can deliver for centuries to come. Every decision Stevenson makes reflects his belief that compromise equals failure, and failure equals death for future mariners who will depend on this light. As autumn approaches, the workers race to complete their barracks before winter. Weather makes the rock uninhabitable. The structure takes shape slowly, walls rising board by board, roof beams carefully fitted, windows installed to provide light for the long nights ahead. By September, the building nears completion, offering hope that the crew will have adequate shelter for the winter months. But the North Atlantic has its own schedule, and it does not recognize human deadlines. On September 11, 1838, the weather forces Stevenson to end the working season with the barracks still unfinished. The structure stands 3/4 complete, lacking only final details that seemed achievable in a few more days of favorable conditions. The crew evacuates to the mainland, leaving their incomplete shelter to face the winter storms alone. For 2 months, the barracks endures everything the ocean can deliver. The workers who built it calculate wind loads and wave forces, confident that their construction can survive until spring returns. The building represents months of backbreaking labor, careful planning, and scarce materials transported at enormous cost across treacherous waters. On November 3, 1838, a storm of unprecedented fury strikes the Hebrides. Waves higher than houses crash across Skerryvore Reef with such violence that spray rises 200 ft into the air. The wind reaches velocities that strip bark from trees on distant islands and drive salt spray miles inland. When the storm finally exhausts itself 3 days later, every trace of the barracks has vanished. The disaster hits Alan Stevenson like a physical blow. 6 months of work, thousands of pounds in materials, and the morale of his entire project have been swept away in a single night. Insurance companies and government officials begin questioning whether the lighthouse project should continue. The The Northern Lighthouse Board faces pressure to abandon Scarborough and seek alternative solutions to mark the dangerous reef. But Stevenson's response to the catastrophe reveals the depths of his obsession with perfection. Instead of retreating or modifying his plans, he doubles down on his commitment to build the ultimate lighthouse. The destruction of the barracks only proves to him that ordinary construction methods cannot survive on Scarivore. He must build better, stronger, more precisely engineered structures that can withstand forces that destroyed his first attempt. The engineer spends the winter of 1838 to 39 redesigning every aspect of the project. He studies the patterns of the November storm, calculates the forces that destroyed his barracks, and develops new construction techniques that will resist similar attacks. His obsession with perfection intensifies rather than diminishes, driving him to create plans that exceed even his original demanding specifications. When work resumes on May 6, 1839, Stevenson brings a determination that borders on mania. The new barracks design incorporates lessons learned from the previous year's disaster. Thicker timbers, deeper foundations, more secure fastenings, and improved drainage systems reflect his belief that failure results from insufficient attention to detail rather than impossible conditions. The workers who return to Scarborough in 1839 find their employer changed by the winter's setback. The Alan Stevenson, who had driven them hard in 1838, now pushes them beyond normal human limits. He arrives earlier, works later, and demands standards of precision that seem almost impossible to achieve. Every measurement must be perfect.
Every joint must be flawless.
Every component must exceed the specifications that govern the destroyed barracks. James Wilson, a carpenter from Ubin, later writes to his wife about the atmosphere on Scarivore during the 1839 season. Mr. Stevenson has the look of a man possessed. He sees mistakes where none exist and demands perfection where good enough would serve. The other men whisper that the reef has claimed his reason along with our barracks. The psychological pressure of working under Stevenson's microscopic supervision begins to take its toll on the crew. Men who had worked construction jobs for decades find themselves criticized for techniques that had served them well on previous projects. The engineer's insistence on perfection creates an atmosphere of constant tension where every worker fears that his best effort will be judged inadequate. Yet somehow the new barracks takes shape under this regime of obsessive perfectionism. Each board is fitted with tolerances measured in fractions of inches. Every joint is tested and retested before final assembly. The structure that emerges reflects Stevenson's belief that only superhuman effort can create buildings capable of surviving on Scarborough Reef. The completion of the barracks on September 3, 1839 marks a turning point in the project. The structure survives the winter of 1839 to 40 intact, proving that Stevenson's perfectionist approach can produce results, but the victory comes at a cost that extends beyond money and materials. The engineer's health shows signs of strain from months of 17-hour workdays and constant mental pressure. As the project moves into its construction phase in 1840, Stevenson's obsession with perfection extends to every aspect of the lighthouse itself. The granite blocks quarried on the Ross of Mull must meet specifications that would challenge modern precision tools. Each stone is measured, weighed, and inspected before being approved for use. Blocks that show even minor flaws are rejected and returned to the quarry for replacement. The masons at Hynish-on-Tyree work under similar pressure to achieve impossible standards. They must shape each granite, block so precisely that it will fit perfectly with its neighbors without requiring on-site modification. The joints between stones must be so tight that no mortar is needed to bind them together. Every surface must be smooth enough to shed water efficiently. Every angle must be calculated to distribute structural loads evenly. Robert Stevenson, Alan's father and a distinguished lighthouse engineer in his own right, begins to worry about his son's mental state as the project progresses. Letters from the period reveal a father's concern for a son who seems to be losing himself in pursuit of an impossible ideal. the elder Stevenson urges moderation, reminding Alan that good engineering requires balance between perfection and practicality. But Alan Stevenson cannot accept anything less than absolute perfection. The lighthouse that rises from his designs must be more than merely adequate. It must be a structure so perfectly engineered that it will stand unchanged for centuries. Every decision he makes reflects his belief that compromise in any detail will ultimately result in failure of the entire project. The foundation ceremony on July 7, 1840 brings the Duke and Duchess of Argyll to witness the laying of the cornerstone. The ceremony should mark a moment of celebration, but Stevenson's behavior during the event reveals the depths of his obsession. He frets over minor details of protocol, worries about the precision of the stone placement, and seems unable to enjoy the recognition his project has earned. As construction progresses through 1841 and 1842, Stevenson's perfectionism creates both remarkable achievements and dangerous working conditions. The lighthouse tower that takes shape exceeds all previous standards for precision engineering. Each of the 97 courses of stone is laid with mathematical accuracy. The hyperbolic curve of the tower's profile represents a perfect balance between strength and wind resistance. But the human cost of this perfection continues to mount. Workers suffer injuries from attempting to meet impossible deadlines under dangerous conditions. The constant pressure to achieve perfect results in imperfect circumstances pushes men beyond their limits. Several workers request transfers to other projects, unable to endure the psychological strain of working under Stevenson's obsessive supervision. The installation of the lighthouse lens and lighting apparatus in 1843 represents the culmination of Stevenson's perfectionist vision. The Fresnel lens system he designs for Scarborough incorporates innovations that will influence lighthouse construction for decades. Every component is manufactured to specifications that push the limits of 19th century precision engineering. When Thomas Stevenson takes over final completion of the project in 1843, he finds a structure that represents both triumph and tragedy. The Skerryvore lighthouse that his brother has created stands as one of the most perfectly engineered structures of its era. But the cost of that perfection includes Alan Stevenson's health, the morale of his workers, and relationships with colleagues who questioned his methods. The lighthouse exhibits its first light on February 1, 1844. Casting its beam across waters that had claimed countless vessels. The light represents the fulfillment of Alan Stevenson's vision, a perfect structure that will guide ships safely past the hidden dangers of Skerryvore Reef. Every measurement, every joint, every component has been engineered to the highest possible standards, but perfection extracts its own price. Alan Stevenson's health never fully recovers from the 6 years of obsessive effort that created the Skerryvore lighthouse. The engineer who demanded superhuman effort from himself and his workers bears the permanent scars of his impossible quest for flawless construction. The lighthouse itself becomes a monument to both human achievement and human obsession. Its graceful hyperbolic curve rises 156 heft above the reef, visible for 23 nautical miles in clear weather. Ships that depend on its guidance benefit from engineering standards that exceeded anything previously attempted in lighthouse construction. Yet, the workers who built the lighthouse carry their own memories of the price paid for that perfection. They remember the 17-hour days, the impossible standards, the constant pressure to achieve flawless results in conditions that seem designed to prevent success. Some speak with pride about their role in creating an engineering masterpiece. Others describe the project as a descent into madness disguised as professional dedication. The Skerryvore lighthouse continues to operate today, its light automated but its structure unchanged from Stevenson's original design. The granite blocks quarried on Mull and shaped at Hynish still fit together with the precision that their crater demanded. The tower that rises from the reef represents one of the most perfectly engineered lighthouses ever built. Bass Rock Lighthouse. Construction mysteries 1902, blood mixes with seawater on the granite steps of Bass Rock 12 FT above the FTH of 4th. October the 16th, 1902, the wound on Mason William Henderson's forearm streams red as he presses a torn piece of cloth against the gash. Around him, his work crew continues hauling dress stone up from the landing, their voices echoing off the volcanic cliffs that rise 350 ft from the cold Scottish waters. The lighthouse they are building on this desolate outcrop demands blood sacrifice. It seems taking a piece of every man who dares to work on its construction. Henderson knows this is just the latest in a series of accidents that has plagued the Bass Rock project since work began under engineer David Allen Stevenson's direction. But as he watches his blood drip onto stones that will form the foundation of Scotland's newest lighthouse, he cannot know that his testimony and that of his fellow workers will become the only record of the mysterious incidents that surrounded the construction. Incidents that would be forgotten as technology transformed lighthouses from human-tended beacons into automated signals controlled by computers hundreds of miles away. The workers who built Bass Rock Lighthouse carried with them stories that would never make it into official reports or engineering journals. They spoke in hushed voices of tools that went missing in the night, of sounds that had no earthly source, and of accidents that seemed to follow patterns too precise to be mere coincidence. These testimonies, recorded in letters home and whispered conversations in Edinburgh taverns, provide the only glimpse into the human cost of erecting a lighthouse on one of Scotland's most haunted islands. Henderson himself would later write to his wife about the atmosphere on Bass Rock during those construction months. The island, he explained, felt different from other building sites. The massive colony of gunnuts that covered every available ledge created a constant cacophony of screeching cries that made normal conversation impossible. The smell of guano and rotting fish hung thick in the air, forcing men to work with cloth tied over their faces. But worse than the noise or stench was the feeling that they were not alone on the rock. The base rock had served as a fortress and prison for centuries before Stevenson's engineers arrived with their plans for a lighthouse. Medieval ruins dotted the island's surface. The remains of St. Baldridge's cell, a 13th century castle, and the foundations of buildings that had housed political prisoners during the religious persecutions of the 17th century. The workers found human bones scattered throughout the construction site, remains of the 40 Presbyterian ministers who had died in the rocks dungeons during the reign of Charles II. Thomas Mackenzie, the project's chief carpenter, wrote detailed accounts of the strange incidents that plagued the lighthouse construction. Tools would be carefully arranged at the end of each workday, only to be found scattered across the site the following morning. Rope and tackle would show signs of tampering despite being stored in locked sheds. Most disturbing of all, workers reported hearing voices calling from the ruins of the old castle, speaking words in languages none of them recognized. The construction itself presented challenges that pushed both men and machinery beyond normal limits. Every piece of building material had to be transported by boat from the mainland, then hauled up the island's steep cliffs using a system of pulley and winches. The massive stones for the lighthouse tower, each weighing several tons, required precise coordination between boat crews, crane operators, and ground workers to position correctly. David Allen Stevenson, the project's engineer, maintained meticulous records of the technical aspects of construction. But his reports contained no mention of the human drama that unfolded alongside the building work. Stevenson came from the famous lighthouse building family that had illuminated Scotland's coasts for generations. His grandfather, Robert, had built the Belrock Lighthouse, while his father, David, had designed lights throughout the Highlands and Islands. But the Bass Rock project tested even the Stevenson family's legendary expertise. The island's location at the entrance to the further of Forth exposed it to fierce storms that could arrive with little warning. Construction crews working on the exposed rockface found themselves racing against time to secure equipment and reach shelter as weather conditions deteriorated rapidly. The lighthouse design called for a white tower 20 meters high, rising from foundations blasted directly into the volcanic rock. The structure had to withstand not only the massive winter storms that swept down from the North Sea, but also the constant vibration caused by tens of thousands of nesting seabirds. Every joint, every connection, every structural element required engineering calculations that accounted for forces no mainland building would ever face. Alexander Sinclair, serving as a foreman mason for the project, documented the daily struggles of working in such extreme conditions. The constant bird noise made verbal communication nearly impossible, forcing workers to develop an elaborate system of hand signals. The omnipresent guano made every surface treacherous, causing frequent slips and falls that resulted in injuries ranging from minor cuts to broken bones. More troubling to Sinclair were the incidents that seemed to defy logical explanation. Work would progress normally for days, then suddenly encounter setbacks that appeared to have no natural cause. Stone blocks that had been perfectly fitted the previous evening would be found cracked or displaced by morning. Mortar that should have cured overnight would remain soft and unusable, forcing workers to remove and replace entire sections of construction. The workers began to develop their own theories about the mysterious setbacks. Some blamed the ghosts of the Presbyterian prisoners who had died on the island centuries earlier. Others suggested that the massive gannet colony somehow interfered with construction through vibrations or chemical effects from their droppings. A few insisted that the island itself resisted human intrusion, fighting back against the lighthouse that would forever change its character. Robert Malaud, a young laborer from the Hebrides, provided some of the most detailed testimony about the strange occurrences during construction. Malaud spoke Gaelic as his first language and claimed to understand some of the voices that other workers dismissed as wind or bird cries. According to his account, the sounds came from the ruins of St. Baldred's cell and seemed to be warnings or protests against the disruption of the island's ancient peace. The physical dangers of the construction work proved very real regardless of their supernatural origin. The steep cliffs, unpredictable weather, and heavy machinery created constant hazards for the work crews. William Henderson's injury was typical. A sharp edge of granite had opened his arm to the bone as he struggled to position a foundation stone in a rising wind. Similar accidents occurred almost daily, creating a steady stream of injured workers requiring medical attention on the mainland. Dr. James Murray, the physician who treated most of the construction injuries, noted patterns in his patient reports that seemed to suggest more than random bad luck. Injuries occurred most frequently during certain phases of the moon, often involved similar types of accidents and seemed to cluster around specific areas of the construction site. Murray, a rational man trained in scientific medicine, found himself wondering if environmental factors on base rock somehow increased the likelihood of accidents. The most serious incident occurred on November 2nd, 1902, when a sudden storm struck the island while a full crew was working to complete the lighthouse's upper sections. The wind rose from calm to gale force in less than 30 minutes, catching workers exposed on scaffolding that extended around the tower's growing height. James Thompson, an experienced rigger, was blown from his platform and fell 40 ft to the rocks below, suffering injuries that ended his construction career. Thompson's accident prompted Stevenson to implement new safety protocols that required constant weather, monitoring an immediate work cessation when conditions became dangerous. But the workers noticed that the storm had seemed to target their scaffolding specifically, leaving other structures on the island relatively undamaged. The incident reinforced their growing belief that Bass Rock itself opposed the lighthouse construction. As winter approached and work neared completion, the frequency of mysterious incidents actually increased rather than diminished. Tools would vanish for days, only to reappear in impossible locations. Freshly mixed mortar would turn to useless powder overnight, despite being properly covered. Most disturbing of all, workers began reporting that they felt watched constantly, as if unseen observers monitored their every movement. The lighthouse finally began operation on November 1st, 1902, its gas-powered beam cutting through the darkness to warn ships away from the treacherous rock surrounding Bass Rock. The initial lighting ceremony brought officials from the Northern Lighthouse Board to witness the culmination of the construction project, but the celebration was subdued by the memory
Of all the accidents and strange occurrences that had
marked the building process. David Alan Stevenson's official completion report focused on technical specifications, construction costs, and performance capabilities of the new lighthouse. The document made no mention of the human stories that had unfolded during construction. The injuries, the mysterious incidents, the workers' growing belief that they had disturbed forces better left alone. For the official record, Bass Rock Lighthouse represented another successful project by Scotland's premier lighthouse engineering firm. But the workers who had actually built the lighthouse carried different memories of their time on the island. They remembered the constant feeling of being observed by unseen watchers, the tools that moved in the night, the accidents that seemed to follow unnatural patterns. Their letters home and conversations in mainland taverns preserved stories that would never appear in engineering journals or government reports. The transition from manual lighthouse operation to automated systems would eventually eliminate the human presence that had maintained these lights for over a century. In 1988, Bass Rock Lighthouse joined hundreds of others in converting to automatic operation, ending the era of lighthouse keepers who lived on remote stations and tended the lights personally. The automation process brought teams of technicians to Bass Rock to install electronic equipment, computer controls, and satellite communication systems that would monitor the lighthouse remotely. These modern workers found no evidence of the mysterious incidents that had plagued construction 86 years earlier. Their sophisticated instruments detected no unusual electromagnetic fields, structural vibrations, or environmental conditions that might explain the earlier reports. Ian Stewart, the lead technician for the 1988 automation project, later described his work on Bass Rock as routine and uneventful. The installation proceeded on schedule without accidents, equipment failures, or unexplained delays. Stewart attributed the earlier construction problems to the primitive working conditions and safety standards of 1902, dismissing worker testimony about supernatural interference as typical folklore from a superstitious
age. The contrast between the
1902 construction experience and the 1988 automation work highlighted the transformation that had occurred in lighthouse technology and maritime safety. Where Henderson and his colleagues had struggled with basic tools and dangerous working conditions, Stewart's team used precision instruments, comprehensive safety protocols, and communication systems that ensured constant contact with mainland support services. Modern lighthouse operation relies on networks of sensors, computers, and communication links that monitor equipment status, weather conditions, and shipping traffic automatically. The Bass Rock light that once required constant human attention now operates for months without direct intervention. Its electronic systems adjusting beam intensity, monitoring for failures and reporting status to control centers hundreds of miles away. The automation revolution that swept through lighthouse services in the 1980s eliminated thousands of jobs held by keepers who had devoted their lives to maintaining navigation aids. These men, many from families with generations of lighthouse service, found their skills suddenly obsolete as computers took over functions that had required years of training and experience to master. Former lighthouse keeper Malcolm Sinclair, grandson of the mason who had worked on Bass Rock's construction, witnessed the end of his profession during the automation era. Sinclair had spent 30 years tending lights throughout the Scottish Islands, following family traditions that stretched back to the early 1800s. The electronic systems that replaced him could perform his duties more reliably than any human. but they could not provide the local knowledge, emergency response capabilities, and human presence that keepers had offered. The stories told by construction workers like Henderson and Thompson represent a vanishing link to the human side of lighthouse history. Their accounts of dangerous working conditions, mysterious incidents, and the daily struggle to build navigation aids on remote rocks provide context that official engineering reports cannot capture. These testimonies remind us that every lighthouse represented not just a technical achievement, but a human story of dedication, sacrifice, and sometimes unexplained encounters with forces beyond understanding. The Bass Rock Lighthouse continues to operate today, its automated systems faithfully maintaining the beam that guides ships through the treacherous waters around the island. The massive gannet colony still covers every available ledge. Their cries still echo off the ancient ruins, and storms still batter the exposed rock with tremendous force. But the lighthouse stands unchanged, its white tower rising exactly as David Allen Stevenson designed it over a century ago. Visitors to Bass Rock today find no trace of the mysterious incidents that troubled its construction. The island serves as a nature reserve where scientists study seabird behavior and marine ecosystems. The lighthouse operates with mechanical precision, its beams sweeping across the further or fourth every 20 seconds, exactly as programmed by computers that never sleep, never doubt, and never report encounters with the unexplained. HMS Array Submarine 1951. The telephone rings in homes across Portsmouth at dawn on April 18, 1951. Each call brings the same terrible news. HMS Affray has failed to surface from a routine training exercise. Wives clutch the receivers with trembling hands. Mothers sink into kitchen chairs. Children ask why their fathers haven't come home for breakfast. In naval quarters throughout the port city, curtains remain drawn as families begin the agonizing wait for news that may never come. Mrs. Joan Blackburn stands at her front window watching other Navy wives gather in small groups on the street corners. Her husband, Lieutenant John Blackburn, commands HMS Arai 24 hours ago. He kissed her goodbye before departing for what should have been a simple training dive. Now she faces a silence that grows more frightening with each passing hour. The submarine that carried 75 men beneath the English Channel has simply vanished. The mystery of HMS Array begins with this moment of terrible uncertainty as families discover that their loved ones have disappeared beneath waters that should have been as familiar as Portsmouth Harbour itself. To understand how this tragedy unfolded, we must work backwards through the final hours before Lieutenant Blackburn and his crew made their last dive. April 16, 1951. 4 in the afternoon, HMS Array slips her moorings at HMS Dolphin, the Royal Navy's submarine base in Gosaport. The sleek A-class submarine cuts through Portsmouth Harbour with a quiet efficiency that has marked her 6 years of service. Lieutenant Blackburn stands on the bridge conducting the familiar routine of taking his boat to sea for exercise training spring. The submarine carries more men than usual for this training mission. Along with her regular crew of 60 officers and ratings, Affray embarks 21 submarine officers undergoing training and 4 Royal Marines from the Special Boat Section. These additional personnel transform what should be a routine exercise into a crowded underwater classroom where experienced submariners teach the next generation of officers. Sub-Lieutenant David Bennington, one of the trainee officers, writes a final letter to his parents before departure. The 23-year-old describes his excitement about the upcoming exercise, his confidence in Lieutenant Blackburn's leadership, and his plans for shore leave after the training mission. The letter posted that morning will arrive at his family home 2 days after HMS Affray disappears. The submarine's destination lies 30 mi south of the Isle of Wight, where she will dive to begin a simulated war patrol. The exercise calls for a free-to-proceed underwater to a position 20 mi southeast of start point, then surface to report her arrival. The mission represents standard training for submarine crews, the kind of routine operation that the Royal Navy has conducted thousands of times without incident. At 8:56 p.m. on April 16th, Lieutenant Blackburn transmits his final radio message to shore, diving at 21:15 in position 5,10N0145W for exercise training spring. The signal received clearly at the Admiralty Communications Center contains no hint of distress or mechanical problems. Blackburn reports his position, confirms his diving time, and signs off with the routine formality that marks all naval communications. 20 minutes later, HMS A. Frey slips beneath the dark waters of the English Channel. Her 75 occupants begin what they expect to be a routine underwater transit, unaware that they are starting a journey from which none will return. The submarine's hull plates echo with the familiar sounds of diving. Ballast tanks flooding, trim pumps adjusting the boat's underwater balance. The gentle hum of electric motors that will carry them through the night. Leading seaman William Hale moves through the submarine's forward compartment, checking instruments and monitoring the complex systems that keep their underwater world habitable. At 34 years old, Hale brings 12 years of submarine experience to his duties. He has served on boats that survived German depth charge attacks during the war, and he understands better than most the thin margin between safety and disaster that defines life beneath the sea. The training officers crowd into whatever spaces they can find in the submarine's cramped interior. Lieutenant Commander Hugh Canning, the senior student officer, reviews navigation charts with his classmates as they discuss the tactical problems they will solve during the exercise. These men represent the future of the Royal Navy's submarine service, carefully selected for their intelligence and leadership potential. Royal Marine Sergeant James Leadbetter and his 3 companions prepare for their portion of the exercise, a simulated beach reconnaissance that will test their ability to land from a submarine and gather intelligence on enemy positions. The Special Boat Section represents an elite unit trained for the most dangerous maritime operations, and this exercise offers valuable practice in submarine-launched missions. As midnight approaches, HMS Ari continues her underwater transit toward the exercise area. The submarine operates at periscope depth, using her snorkel mask to run the diesel engines and charge the massive batteries that power her electric motors. This method of operation, developed by the German during World War II, allows submarines to remain submerged for extended periods while maintaining full power. But something goes wrong in the early hours of April 17th. The exact sequence of events remains unclear. Buried with the submarine in the cold depths of Herd Deep, what seems certain is that HMS Fries suffers a catastrophic failure that prevents her from surfacing as scheduled. When dawn breaks on April 17th, the submarine fails to report her arrival at the designated exercise area. Naval communications operators wait through the morning for word from Lieutenant Blackburn. Protocol allows for some delay in reporting positions, accounting for operational requirements or communication difficulties that might prevent immediate contact. But as the hours pass without any signal from HMS Arie, concern grows into alarm among the staff officers monitoring exercise training spring. By afternoon on April 17th, the Royal Navy launches search and rescue operations across the English Channel. Ships and aircraft comb the waters where HMS A. Frey should have surfaced, looking for any sign of the missing submarine. The search expands rapidly as time passes without contact, involving vessels from multiple naval bases and support from the Royal Air Force. Back in Portsmouth, families gather at the homes of senior officers' wives seeking comfort and information about the search efforts. Mrs. Blackburn finds herself at the center of these informal gatherings, other wives looking to her for strength and leadership during the crisis. She maintains outward composure while privately struggling with fears she cannot voice. The possibility that her husband and his crew lie trapped on the bottom of the sea. The children of HMS Array's crew face their own confusion and fear. As the search continues, 8-year-old Michael Bennington asks his mother why his father hasn't called from the submarine as promised. She struggles to explain the situation without destroying his faith that everything will be fine, that the Royal Navy will find their submarine and bring the men home safely. Lieutenant Peter Chapman of HMS Sidon, a sister submarine dispatched to join the search, later describes the eerie sensation of hunting for a vessel identical to his own. Chapman and his crew understand the dangers facing submariners better than the surface ships involved in the operation. They know that somewhere beneath the English Channel, 75 men may be fighting for their lives in a disabled submarine, waiting for rescue that might never come. On April 19th, the Admiralty officially declares HMS Arai missing with all hands. The announcement delivered to families by uniformed officers bearing the distinctive regrets of the Royal Navy transforms the anxious, waiting into confirmed grief. Mrs. Blackburn receives the news with the composure expected of a naval officer's wife, but neighbours report hearing sobs from her house late into the night. The search for HMS Ari continues for weeks after the official declaration of loss. Deep-sea salvage vessels equipped with underwater cameras and grappling equipment methodically survey the seabed looking for any trace of the missing submarine. The operation becomes one of the largest peacetime search efforts in Royal Navy history, involving resources from across the fleet. Royal Navy divers work in conditions that push the limits of their equipment and training. The waters where HMS of Frey likely lies exceed the safe depth limits for conventional diving apparatus, requiring experimental techniques and equipment that have never been tested in operational conditions. These men risk their own lives attempting to reach comrades who may already be beyond help. The families left behind face the unique tragedy of submarine loss, the complete disappearance of their loved ones without bodies to bury or wreckage to confirm their
fate. Mrs. Bennington struggles to explain to her children why their father
cannot come home, why the powerful Royal Navy
cannot simply lift his submarine from the bottom of the
sea and bring him back to Portsmouth. Investigation into HMS Free's loss reveals the inherent dangers of submarine operations. Even during peacetime exercises, the complex systems that allow submarines to operate beneath the sea can fail catastrophically, turning these vessels into death traps for their crews. The official inquiry examines every aspect of the submarine's design, maintenance, and operation, searching for clues to explain the disaster. Evidence suggests that HMS Frey suffered a failure of her snorkel mast while operating at periscope depth. This critical component allows submerged submarines to run their diesel engines, but if damaged, it can flood the boat through a 10-in opening directly connected to the interior. The submarine safety systems designed to prevent such flooding may have malfunctioned at the crucial moment when they were needed most. The loss of HMS Frey exposes the psychological strain placed on submarine families who must live with the knowledge that their husbands and fathers
work in one of the most dangerous
environments on Earth. Unlike surface ships, which leave wreckage and survivors when they sink, submarines often disappear completely, taking their crews into depths where rescue becomes impossible. Support networks among submarine families prove crucial during the weeks following the disaster. Women who have never met before bond over their shared loss, creating informal groups that provide emotional support and practical assistance. These relationships forged in tragedy will endure for decades, as the widows and children of HMS Frey's crew help each other navigate life without their loved ones. The Royal Navy's response to the disaster includes both practical and ceremonial elements. Families receive pensions and support services, while memorial services honor the sacrifice of the 75 men lost aboard HMS Ari. But these official gestures cannot address the deeper questions raised by the submarine's disappearance, how such disasters can be prevented, and whether the risks of submarine service are justified by strategic necessity. Technical analysis of similar submarines reveals potential design flaws that may have contributed to HMS Frey's loss. The snorkel system, while revolutionary and extending underwater endurance, creates vulnerabilities that did not exist in earlier submarine designs. The complex sequence of operations required for safe snorkeling leaves multiple opportunities for human error or mechanical failure. The investigation also examines the crowded conditions aboard HMS Arai during her final voyage. With 25 additional personnel beyond her normal complement, the submarine operated with limited space for emergency procedures and evacuation. This overcrowding, while not necessarily contributing to the initial disaster, may have hampered the crew's ability to respond effectively to whatever emergency they faced. Training procedures come under scrutiny as investigators examine whether the submarine's crew was adequately prepared for the specific dangers of snorkel operations. The relatively new technology requires skills and procedures that differ significantly from traditional submarine operations.
And the Royal Navy's training.
Programs may not have kept pace with the evolving technology. The human stories emerging from HMS Free's loss illustrate the broader impact of military disasters on families and communities.
Children grow up without fathers.
Wives face decades as single parents, and entire social networks built around naval service collapse when 75 men disappear in a single incident. These personal tragedies extend far beyond the immediate families to affect friends, colleagues, and neighbors throughout Portsmouth's naval community. Recovery of HMS Afrai's wreck in June 1951 provides closure for some families, while raising new questions about the disaster's cause. The submarine lies in Herd Deep, broken in two sections with her bow pointing toward the surface as if she attempted to emergency blow to the surface before being overwhelmed by flooding. The wreck's condition suggests a rapid catastrophic failure that gave the crew little time to respond. Physical evidence from the wreck supports the theory that HMS Array's snorkel mast fractured during operations, allowing massive flooding that sank the submarine before emergency procedures could save her. The investigation concludes that this mechanical failure combined with possible malfunctions in the boat's safety systems created conditions that no amount of crew training or experience could have overcome. The families of HMS Free's crew faced the complex emotions that follow the recovery of the wreck. While physical proof of their loved one's fate provides some closure, it also confirms that the men died trapped in their submarine,
unable to escape as water flooded their
underwater world. This knowledge brings both resolution and renewed grief to families who have spent months hoping for their men's survival. Mrs. Blackburn later describes the day she received confirmation of her husband's death as both the worst and most peaceful day of her widowhood. The uncertainty that had tormented her for months finally ended, allowing her to begin the process of mourning and rebuilding her life. But she also speaks of dreams in which her husband still commands his submarine somewhere beneath the English Channel, forever frozen at the moment of his final dive. The memorial services held for HMS Array's crew bring together families, naval personnel, and civilians affected by the disaster. These ceremonies serve multiple purposes: honoring the dead, supporting the grieving, and reaffirming the values that make submarine service meaningful despite its dangers. The rituals of military mourning provide structure for emotions that resist easy expression or understanding. Roanoke Colony, 1587 to 1590. Love carves itself into the human heart with the same permanence that wind and rain etch stone, leaving marks that endure long after the forces that created them fade into memory. In the summer of 1587, John White watches his daughter Elelena prepare for the birth of her first child on a windswept island off the coast of what will someday be called North Carolina. Elelena White-Dare, barely 20 years old, carries within her body the future of English settlement in the New World, a child who will be the first of her people born on the American soil. White understands the weight of this moment better than most men his age. As governor of the Roanoke colony, He bears responsibility for the 117 settlers who have followed him across 3,000 mi of ocean to establish England's foothold in America. But as Elelanena's father, he feels the deeper burden of a man who has brought his family into unknown dangers for the promise of something better than the life they left behind. The colony that White has established on Roanoke Island represents hope built on desperation. These families have abandoned everything familiar: their homes, their communities, their connections to a world they understood to gamble their lives on the possibility
of prosperity in a land that has already claimed the
lives of earlier English settlers. White knows the odds against their success, but he also knows that love for his family and faith in their future have brought him too far to turn back. Now, the birth of Virginia Dare on August 18, 1587 marks both triumph and the beginning of tragedy for the Roanoke colony. Elelaneina labors through the humid Carolina night with only the help of other colonial women, far from the midwives and physicians who might have eased her suffering. When her daughter finally arrives with the dawn, the child's first cry announces the arrival of the first English person born in America, a distinction that will outlive the colony itself. John White holds his granddaughter with hands that shake from more than age. Virginia Dare represents everything he hopes the colony will become.
a bridge between the old world and the new, a symbol of English determination to establish permanent roots in America.
But even as he marvels at the perfect tiny fingers and listens to her strong voice, White knows that his colony faces crises that threaten its survival. The settlers have arrived too late in the season to plant crops that will sustain them through the coming winter, their supplies intended to last until the next relief. Expedition dwindle faster than expected as more colonists fall ill with diseases that seem to breed in the hot, humid climate. The local native. American tribes, initially curious about these pale strangers, grow increasingly hostile as they realize the English intend permanent settlement rather than temporary trading. Within weeks of Virginia's birth, White faces an impossible choice. The colony desperately needs supplies from England: food, medicine, tools, and additional settlers to replace those lost to disease and desertion. Someone must return to England to organize a relief expedition, but the journey will take months, even under the best conditions. White, as the only colonist with the necessary connections to secure funding and supplies, represents the colony's best hope for survival. The decision to leave his daughter and granddaughter tears at White's soul. Elelaneina has not yet recovered from childbirth when her father announces his plan to return to England. Baby Virginia, barely a month old, requires constant care that stretches the colony's limited resources. White knows that by leaving he abandons his family to dangers he cannot predict or control. But he also knows that without his intervention, the entire colony will face slow death from starvation. The colonists extract a promise from White before allowing him to depart. If circumstances force them to abandon Roanoke Island, they will carve their destination into a prominent tree or post. If they leave under duress, driven away by attack or other emergency, they will add a cross above the carved message. These simple signals represent their only means of communicating with the relief expedition that White promises to organize. Elelaneina holds. Virginia closes as her father prepares to board the ship that will carry him back to England. The August heat makes every movement exhausting, but she forces herself to walk to the shore where White's beside the small boat that will take him to the larger vessel anchored offshore. The baby in her arms represents hope for the future. But Elelaneina understands that her father's departure may mean she will never see him again. The goodbye between White and his family unfolds with the painful restraint that marks all colonial farewells. Tears and desperate embraces might undermine the morale that keeps the colony functioning. So, father and daughter exchange formal words while their hearts break with unspoken fears. White kisses his granddaughter's forehead and promises Elena that he will return with supplies and reinforcements before winter arrives. But White's ship has barely disappeared. Over the horizon, when events beyond his control begin, conspiring to delay his return, England faces its own crisis as King Philip II of Spain assembles the largest invasion fleet in human history. The Spanish Armada threatens to destroy English naval power and restore Catholic rule to a Protestant nation that has dared to challenge Spanish dominance of the New World. White's urgent appeals for ships and supplies fall on deaf ears as English merchants and naval officials focus their attention on the approaching Spanish threat. Every available vessel is pressed into service for England's defence, leaving no ships free for colonial relief expeditions. White watches helplessly as weeks stretch into months, then months into years, while the Armada crisis consumes England's resources and attention. The defeat of the Spanish Armada in 1588 should have freed ships for the Roanoke relief expedition. But England's war with Spain continues through raids, counter-raids, and naval battles that keep the country on the wartime footing. White struggles to organize private expeditions, but merchants demand guarantees of profit that he cannot provide. The colony that seemed so important in 1587 fades from English priorities as newer schemes and emergencies demand attention. Meanwhile, on Roanoke Island, Elena faces the daily struggle of raising a child in conditions that test human endurance. Virginia grows from infant to toddler in a world where food shortages alternate with brief periods of plenty, where disease strikes without warning, and where the constant threat of Native American attack keeps adults armed and watchful. The little girl learns to walk on sandy paths between rough shelters that represent her people's only protection against the wilderness. The colony situation deteriorates steadily through 1588 and 1589. Crops planted in the wrong season produce mega harvests that cannot sustain over 100 people through the winter months. Hunting and fishing provide some relief, but the colonists lack the skills necessary to live off the land as effectively as the Native Americans who have occupied this territory for generations. Disease claims lives regularly, reducing the colony's numbers while weakening those who survive. Elena watches her daughter develop the resilience that life demands from colonial children. Virginia learns to find comfort in simple pleasures: shells gathered from the beach, wildflowers picked from the dunes, songs her mother sings to help her sleep despite the sounds of wind and waves that remind them constantly of their isolation. The child knows no other world than this precarious existence on the edge of a vast continent. The decision to abandon Roanoke Island probably comes gradually rather than suddenly. Food shortages, declining health among the colonists, and increasing pressure from hostile Native American tribes create conditions that make continued occupation impossible. The colonists may have planned to move only temporarily, seeking better hunting grounds or more defensible positions while waiting for relief from England. The final days of the Roanoke colony remain shrouded in mystery, but Elena and Virginia probably face them together with the stoic courage that defines colonial women. Whether the colonists attempted to sail to Chesapeake Bay in small boats, joined friendly Native American tribes, or met some other fate, Elena would have protected her daughter with the fierce devotion that motherhood demands. The carving of Croatan into the palisade post represents someone's final attempt to communicate with John White. Croatoan Island, 50 miles south of Roanoke, was home to friendly Native Americans who had maintained good relations with earlier English expeditions. The message suggests that at least some colonists hoped to reach this refuge, perhaps believing that White would eventually return to find them there. White's return to Roanoke Island on August 18, 1590, exactly 3 years after Virginia Dear's birth, brings him face to face with the emptiness that haunts every parent's worst nightmares. The palisade still stands, but the houses within are dismantled. Personal belongings have been removed with care rather than haste, suggesting that the colonists left according to plan rather than fleeing from immediate danger. The absence of a cross above the carved message offers White some hope that his
family left voluntarily rather than under attack.
But the advanced season and dangerous weather prevent him from sailing to Croatan Island to search for survivors. His ship's crew, eager to return to England before winter storms make ocean travel impossible, refuse to risk their lives for colonists who may already be dead. White's search of the abandoned settlement reveals evidence of lives interrupted but not destroyed by violence. Children's toys lie scattered near house foundations. Garden plots show signs of recent cultivation. Armor and weapons that would have been essential for defense remain behind, suggesting that the colonists felt safe enough to leave valuable equipment. Rather than carrying it to their new location, the mystery of Elena and Virginia's fate becomes inseparable from the broader question of what happened to all 117 Roanoke colonists. Archaeological evidence suggests that some may have integrated with Native American communities. The English identity gradually absorbed into the cultural patterns of their adopted people. DNA studies of modern Native American populations hint at European ancestry that could derive from Roanoke survivors. But for John White, scientific speculation cannot heal the wound left by losing his family to the American wilderness. His writings from the period reveal a man consumed by guilt over his decision to leave Roanoke, tormented by images of what Elena and Virginia might have suffered in his absence. The grandfather who held his granddaughter on the day of her birth never learns whether she lived to see her 4th birthday. The legend of Virginia Deer transforms the lost child into a symbol of American origins. But this mythologizing obscures the human reality of families destroyed by colonial ambitions. Elena Dyer, barely remembered in popular accounts of the lost colony, represents thousands of women who sacrificed their lives for the dream of American settlement. Her courage in bearing and raising a child under impossible conditions deserves recognition equal to that given her more famous daughter. The demographic reality of the Roanoke colony highlights the desperate nature of their situation. Of the 117 colonists, at least 25 were women and children whose survival depended entirely on the success of the agricultural and hunting efforts of the adult men. When those efforts failed, the entire community faced a choice between slow death from starvation and the unknown risks of abandoning their settlement. Modern research suggests that drought conditions during the late 1580s made farming particularly difficult in the Roanoke area. Tree ring data indicates that the colonists arrived during one of the worst droughts in 800 years, creating conditions that would have challenged even experienced farmers. The English, with their limited knowledge of American crops and growing conditions, faced nearly impossible odds of producing adequate food supplies. The Roanoke colonists also contended with political complications that their leaders had not anticipated. Native American tribes in the region were engaged in their own conflicts over territory and resources, leaving little surplus goodwill for European newcomers. The English inability to understand these complex relationships led to diplomatic mistakes that may have contributed to their ultimate disappearance. Environmental factors beyond human control played crucial roles in the colony's fate. Hurricane seasons brought storms that could destroy crops and shelters in a matter of hours. Winter temperatures, while mild by English standards, still required fuel and shelter that strained the colonists' resources. Disease-carrying insects thrived in the humid climate, spreading illnesses that European immune systems could not resist. The children of Roanoke, including Virginia Dare, faced unique challenges that highlight the vulnerability of colonial families. Medical care consisted of folk remedies and prayer, offering little protection against diseases that claimed adult lives regularly. Educational opportunities were limited to what parents could provide, leaving children without the formal schooling that would prepare them for leadership roles in their community. Virginia Deer's brief life, whether it ended in infancy or extended into childhood among Native American adoptive families, represents the broader human cost of European colonization efforts. The child born to symbolize English success in America became instead a reminder of the price paid by families who gambled everything on uncertain dreams of prosperity and freedom. The lighthouse beam fades into dawn, but the questions remain. Ship crews who sailed into fog and never returned. Entire colonies that faded from history, leaving only carved words and empty settlements. And, somewhere in the mist, between the known and unknown, the haunted coastlines keep their ancient watch over secrets that may never be revealed.